Get your hands off me. I have every right to be on this flight. A man is publicly shamed, accused, and physically dragged off an airplane like a criminal. The flight attendant smirks. An arrogant passenger laughs, and the security guards feel powerful. They all judged him by the color of his skin and his casual clothes. But they made one catastrophic mistake. They did not just provoke a passenger. They interfered with a federal investigation. In exactly 8 minutes, these security officers would not only lose their jobs, but face federal charges that would haunt them forever. The flight attendant's career would end. The smug businessman would watch his reputation crumble, and the airline itself would become the center of a nationwide reckoning. But in their arrogance, as they forcibly removed Dominic Reynolds from his seat, they had no idea they were committing a federal offense against one of the FBI's top undercover agents. Stay tuned to witness the moment when raw prejudice collides with absolute authority, when those who abuse their power suddenly find themselves powerless. This is not just a story of mistaken identity. It is what happens when bias meets badge. The low hum of the Boeing 777 engines was a familiar symphony to Dominic Reynolds. At 42, he had spent almost as many hours in the air as he had in FBI field offices over his 15-year career. Today, however, was different. This was not a bureau assignment. This was personal. Dominic leaned his head against the cool plastic of the window frame in row 24, the vibrations of the massive engines a steady pulse against his skull. Outside the tarmac of JFK International was a chaotic ballet of ground crews, baggage carts, and fuel trucks, all moving with a purpose that felt alien to the turmoil in his own heart. The text from his sister had been stark and terrifying. "Mom's in the hospital. It's her heart again. The doctors are saying you should come right away, Dom." He had booked the first available flight, Transnational Airlines Flight 847 to Denver, a 4-hour journey crammed into seat 24B, a middle seat in the economy cabin. He did not mind. For all his high-level clearances and access, Dominic preferred anonymity. He wore a simple gray hoodie over a plain black t-shirt, comfortable jeans, and worn-in sneakers. He carried a single, unassuming black backpack that held little more than a change of clothes, his phone charger, and the tools of his trade, which remained unseen and unmentioned. To the world, he looked like a teacher, perhaps, or a graphic designer, anything but what he was, one of the Bureau's most effective undercover operatives, specializing in domestic terrorism investigations. His current case, the infiltration of the Sovereign Patriot Alliance, a growing militia group with violent intentions, had been building for 11 months. His testimony, scheduled for next week, would dismantle their entire operation. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was getting to Denver, to Eleanor Reynolds, the 72-year-old woman whose strength and wisdom had guided him through a childhood in Baltimore's toughest neighborhoods, through college at Howard University, and ultimately to Quantico. The woman who had taught him that dignity was not just about how others treated you, it was about how you carried yourself when they did not. Dominic had learned early to be two things at once, vigilant and invisible, to observe without being observed, to absorb information while giving away nothing. These skills had served him well at the Bureau, particularly in his undercover work. Today they would serve him on Transnational Airlines Flight 847, though he did not know it yet. He just wanted to be a ghost on this flight, to close his eyes and let the miles dissolve until he could be by his mother's side. He checked his watch. The flight was scheduled to depart in 20 minutes. He had already notified his handler about the family emergency. The Bureau had been understanding. They always were when it came to family matters. What Dominic did not know, as he settled into the cramped middle seat, was that this routine flight would soon become anything but routine, and that the skills that made him an exceptional agent would be tested not in the field, but at 30,000 feet. Transnational Airlines prided itself on efficiency, not comfort. Flight 847's economy section made this philosophy abundantly clear. The seats were arranged in a 3-4-3 configuration, each barely 17 inches wide, with 30 inches of pitch mathematical dimensions that translated to human discomfort over any flight longer than an hour. Dominic's knees nearly touched the seat in front of him, and his shoulders were too broad for the narrow confines of seat 24B. On his left by the window in 24A, a young woman with curly brown hair had already put on noise-canceling headphones and opened a laptop displaying complicated spreadsheets. On his right, the aisle seat 24C remained blissfully empty as boarding continued. The cabin hummed with pre-flight activity. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the narrow aisles, checking overhead bins and responding to passenger requests. The air smelled of recycled oxygen coffee and the faint chemical scent of industrial cleaning products. Announcements crackled over the PA system, first in English, then Spanish, welcoming passengers to Flight 847 bound for Denver, Colorado. Dominic observed it all with professional detachment. The airplane was a microcosm of society he had always thought. A temporary community with its own unwritten rules, hierarchies, and tensions. First-class passengers received their pre-departure beverages. Business class settled into their wider seats with extra legroom. And in economy, people from all walks of life negotiated the small inconveniences and indignities of modern air travel. A family with young children struggled to find overhead space for their carry-ons. An elderly couple helped each other with their seat belts. Two businesswomen compared notes on their upcoming presentation. And through it all, the flight attendants maintained tight smiles and practiced efficiency, their eyes constantly scanning for potential problems. One of these flight attendants caught Dominic's attention. Tall, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun, she moved through the cabin with an air of authority that seemed to go beyond her role. Her name tag read Amanda. Something about her demeanor, the way her smile did not reach her eyes, the way she seemed to evaluate each passenger with a quick up-and-down glance, triggered Dominic's professional instincts. He had learned to read people to sense the subtle differences between normal vigilance and unwarranted suspicion. The flow of boarding passengers began to slow. Dominic breathed a small sigh of relief as it appeared the middle seat might remain empty, a small comfort on what promised to be a stressful day. Then a loud voice cut through the cabin noise. "Excuse me. Coming through 24C, that is me. Pardon me, excuse me." A large man in an expensive charcoal suit pushed his way down the aisle, pulling a leather carry-on that looked like it cost more than some people's monthly rent. He stopped at Dominic's row, glancing at the seat numbers, then at Dominic with poorly disguised disappointment. "Guess we are going to be neighbors," the man said, not really to Dominic, but to the air between them. Dominic nodded politely and shifted slightly to allow the man room to sit. As he did, he caught Amanda the flight attendant watching their interaction with unusual interest, her gaze lingering a beat too long. The plane as a temporary society was about to reveal its darker dynamics, and Dominic Reynolds, trained to notice patterns and anticipate threats, was already sensing the first subtle signs of trouble. The man in 24C settled heavily into his seat, immediately claiming both armrests with a sense of entitlement that required no verbal declaration. He was in his mid-40s with the artificial tan of someone who spent more time in boardrooms than outdoors. His watch, a Rolex Submariner, gleamed ostentatiously as he checked the time and sighed loudly. "Bradley Wilson," he announced, unprompted, extending his hand toward Dominic without actually looking at him. "Wilson Financial Strategies. We are closing a major deal in Denver tomorrow. Should have been in first class, but my assistant screwed up the booking." Dominic shook the man's hand briefly. "Dominic," he replied simply, not offering his last name or profession. Bradley's gaze flickered over Dominic's hoodie and jeans with thinly veiled disapproval before he turned his attention to his phone, tapping aggressively at the screen. "Cannot believe they cram us in like cattle back here," Bradley continued, still not looking at Dominic. "Some of us have important business to conduct." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Some of us, not you. In the galley at the front of the economy section, Amanda Lawson was conducting a pre-flight briefing with the other flight attendants. At 48, she had been with Transnational for 23 years, long enough to remember when the job was still called stewardess, and the industry still held some glamour. Now it was all about efficiency, security, and managing increasingly disgruntled passengers in increasingly confined spaces. "Remember, we have a full flight today," she told the younger flight attendants, her voice crisp with authority. "Security is our priority. If anyone gives you trouble, do not hesitate to inform me or the captain immediately." Her gaze drifted down the aisle to seat 24B to the black man in the hoodie sitting next to the obviously important businessman. Something about the contrast troubled her. In her experience, people usually sat with their own kind. Business people with business people, families with families. This juxtaposition felt off. "James," she addressed a male flight attendant in his early 30s. "Keep an eye on row 24. Something does not feel right." James Peterson nodded, though his expression suggested confusion. "What specifically am I looking for?" Amanda's lips tightened. "Just anything suspicious. Trust me, I have been doing this long enough to sense when something is not right." In the cockpit, Captain Michael Roberts, 52, was running through his pre-flight checks with methodical precision. 28 years as a commercial pilot had taught him to trust his instruments, his training, and his crew in that order. The passengers were not his concern beyond their safety. Their comfort, their disputes, their individual stories, those were for the cabin crew to manage. His domain was the flight deck and the complex machinery that would carry 283 souls safely through the sky. "Transnational 847, you are cleared for pushback." The ground controller's voice crackled through his headset. "Roger that, ground. Transnational 847 commencing pushback." Captain Roberts responded, his voice reflecting the practiced calm that had carried him through thousands of flights. He did not know that this routine flight would soon test his judgment in ways no simulator ever could. That within hours his decision-making would be scrutinized by federal authorities and millions of social media users. That his commitment to crew authority would collide catastrophically with justice. As the plane began to push back from the gate, the final antagonists in this unfolding drama were still going about their duties at Kansas City International Airport, unaware that Flight 847 would make an unscheduled stop that would change their lives forever. Security officers Trevor Mitchell and Javier Ramirez were conducting a routine patrol of Terminal B. At 38, Trevor was a former military police officer who brought the rigid authority of that role to airport security. His partner, 32-year-old Javier, was newer to the job, but eager to prove himself, perhaps too eager. Both men operated with the unquestioning certainty that their authority was absolute within the airport's boundaries. "Anything interesting today?" Javier asked as they walked. "Hopefully not," Trevor replied. "Interesting means paperwork." Neither man could have predicted the mountain of paperwork and federal charges that awaited them in just a few hours' time. Back on Flight 847, the engines roared to life, pushing Dominic Reynolds deeper into his seat. Beside him, Bradley Wilson continued his loud phone conversation, despite the announcements to switch devices to airplane mode. In the galley, Amanda Lawson watched row 24 with narrowing eyes. And somewhere over the American heartland, the inevitable collision of prejudice and justice began its countdown. "Sir, your bag needs to be completely under the seat for takeoff." The sharp voice cut through the cabin noise, causing several passengers to look up. Amanda Lawson stood in the aisle, her gaze fixed on Dominic Reynolds, her smile a rigid formality that did not soften her tone. Dominic glanced down at his backpack, which was already pushed as far under the seat in front of him as the metal supports would allow. "It is," he replied calmly, meeting her gaze. "No, sir, it needs to be completely under the seat," Amanda repeated, speaking with exaggerated slowness, as if addressing someone who might have trouble understanding English. "It is a federal regulation." Dominic noticed that the businessman next to him had a briefcase protruding much further into the legroom space, yet Amanda's attention remained fixed solely on him. "I understand the regulation," Dominic said evenly, "but the bag will not physically go any farther." He demonstrated by gently pushing the bag again, showing how it was blocked by the seat support. Amanda's expression tightened. "Perhaps you should have checked it if it is too large for the space." 3 rows ahead, a white passenger had a duffel bag nearly twice the size of Dominic's backpack, with half of it extending into the legroom space. Amanda had walked past it without comment. "The bag meets carry-on requirements," Dominic stated not argumentatively but factually. "It is as far under as it can go." Bradley Wilson shifted beside him, sighing dramatically and checking his Rolex again. "Some people just do not understand the rules," he muttered loud enough for both Dominic and Amanda to hear. Amanda's expression flickered with something, perhaps appreciation for the support, perhaps something else, before she returned her attention to Dominic. "I am going to have to insist, sir," she said, her tone hardening further. The woman in 24A, whose bag was positioned exactly like Dominic's, pulled off her headphones, a crease forming between her brows as she observed the interaction. "Is there a problem?" she asked, glancing between Dominic and Amanda. "No problem," Dominic replied quietly. "Just a misunderstanding about baggage placement." Amanda's posture stiffened. "There is no misunderstanding. The rules are clear." Dominic maintained his calm demeanor, years of training in high-pressure situations serving him well. He knew this interaction was not about the bag. It was about establishing authority about someone seeing a black man in casual clothes and making assumptions. "I'm happy to check with the captain if there is a question about the regulation," he offered reasonably. "Or perhaps your colleague could provide a second opinion." He nodded toward James, who was watching the interaction from nearby. The mention of involving others seemed to give Amanda pause. She glanced around, suddenly aware of the attention the interaction was drawing from surrounding passengers. "I will return to check again before takeoff," she said finally, the words carrying an unmistakable warning. She moved on, but not before giving Dominic's row one last scrutinizing look. Bradley immediately took the opportunity to spread out further his elbow, now firmly occupying the shared armrest, pushing against Dominic's space. "These flight attendants have a tough job," Bradley commented, though his tone suggested no real sympathy. "So many people these days just do not respect authority." The subtext was clear: people like you. Dominic chose not to engage, instead taking out his phone to send a quick text to his sister before airplane mode would be required. "Still on schedule. Should land by 4 p.m. your time. How's Mom?" The reply came quickly. "Stable for now. Doctor wants to talk when you get here. Love you." Dominic felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the cramped airplane seat. He thought of his mother, the strongest person he had ever known, lying in a hospital bed. He thought of the distance still between them. And he thought of this case waiting for him after this family crisis, the testimony that could put dangerous people behind bars. The petty indignities of this flight were just noise. He had navigated far worse in both his personal and professional life. But as the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, he could not shake the feeling that Amanda Lawson was not finished with him. Something in her gaze suggested that for her, his very presence was a problem to be solved. Beside him, Bradley Wilson finally ended his call as the plane climbed through the clouds. The man reclined his seat to its maximum extent, not much in economy, and closed his eyes, apparently intending to sleep. But not before muttering, "Wake me when they serve drinks. I need a proper scotch after dealing with this seating situation." The woman in 24A caught Dominic's eye and gave a small apologetic smile before returning to her laptop, a silent acknowledgement of the unfairness she had witnessed. Dominic settled back, breathing deeply and centering himself. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the cabin began to settle into the routine of flight. But the undercurrents of tension remained invisible but present, like the high-altitude turbulence that sometimes caught planes unaware. 45 minutes into the flight, the beverage service began. The familiar rattle of the cart moving down the aisle brought passengers out of their individual bubbles of entertainment and reading. Amanda Lawson was working the cart on the left side of the plane, while James Peterson handled the right. Dominic observed the routine with practiced detachment. Amanda maintained her professionally rigid smile for most passengers, occasionally engaging in brief pleasantries with some, particularly the business travelers and well-dressed older passengers. It was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to notice behavioral patterns. The cart approached row 24. By now, the woman in 24A, who had introduced herself as Sarah Goldstein, a data analyst traveling for a conference, had put away her laptop and lowered her tray table. Bradley Wilson had awakened from his short nap and was checking his watch and phone with theatrical impatience. Amanda served Sarah first. "What would you like to drink? Sparkling water with lime, please," Sarah replied. Amanda handed her the drink and a napkin with a practiced efficiency, then turned to Bradley. "And for you, sir," Bradley straightened importantly. "Do you have Macallan, or at least Johnny Walker Black?" "I am sorry, sir. We have Jim Beam or Jack Daniels in economy," Amanda replied, her tone genuinely apologetic. Bradley sighed dramatically. "Jack Daniels, then. Neat with ice on the side." "Of course, sir." Amanda quickly prepared his drink with special attention, even providing 2 packets of pretzels without being asked. She then began to move the cart forward, completely skipping Dominic. "Excuse me," Dominic said politely. "I have not been served yet." Amanda paused, turning back with a look of mild surprise as if she had genuinely forgotten him, though he sat directly between the 2 passengers she had just served. "Oh, what would you like?" Her tone was notably cooler. "Coffee black, please," Dominic replied. Amanda's eyes narrowed slightly. "Have you been drinking today, sir?" The question hung in the air, unexpected and inappropriate. Bradley glanced over with sudden interest. Sarah stopped with her water midway to her lips. "No," Dominic answered calmly, though he felt a familiar tension rising. "Just coffee, thank you." "You seem agitated." Amanda continued, her voice carrying enough to draw attention from nearby rows. "We have a responsibility not to serve passengers who may have been drinking before the flight." Dominic had not raised his voice, had not made any aggressive movements, had done nothing but request the same service every other passenger was receiving. "I have not been drinking," he repeated, his voice level. "I would just like coffee like any other passenger." Amanda held his gaze for a long moment, then poured the coffee with deliberate slowness, placing it on his tray table without a napkin. Some of the hot liquid sloshed over the edge of the cup. "Be careful," she said in a tone that held no actual concern. "It is hot." Bradley smirked beside him, taking a satisfied sip of his Jack Daniels. "Maybe stick to soft drinks next time, buddy," he said, his voice low but deliberately audible to those around them. Sarah Goldstein's expression had shifted from surprise to discomfort, and then to something harder recognition of the injustice playing out beside her. She reached into her bag and pulled out a pack of tissues, quietly offering one to Dominic to clean up the spilled coffee. "Thanks," Dominic said, simply accepting the tissue. "That was completely inappropriate," Sarah said, not bothering to lower her voice, her eyes on Amanda's retreating form. "You should report her." Dominic dabbed at the spilled coffee. "It is fine." "It is not fine," Sarah insisted. "She just racially profiled you in front of an entire plane." Bradley shifted uncomfortably beside them. "Oh, please," he interjected. "Not everything is about race. Maybe he just looked tired and she was being cautious." He emphasized the word tired with a hint of innuendo. Sarah turned to him, her academic demeanor giving way to genuine anger. She served you alcohol without question. She did not even give him a napkin with his coffee. Look, Bradley said, lowering his voice but intensifying his tone. Some of us just know how to conduct ourselves on a flight, okay? It is not the flight attendant's fault if certain people give off vibes. Vibes? Sarah repeated incredulously. What exactly are you implying? Dominic remained silent, watching the interaction with the same observational detachment he had cultivated over years of undercover work. He was documenting patterns, filing away behaviors and responses. This was not just about a coffee or a napkin. It was about how quickly assumptions could escalate, how prejudice could hide behind policies and procedures. Further down the aisle, Dominic noticed Amanda in a hushed conversation with James, both occasionally glancing toward row 24. James seemed to be disagreeing with something Amanda was saying, his body language suggesting reluctance. Dominic sipped his coffee and turned his attention to the window to the endless blue sky beyond the glass. He thought of his mother, who had faced far worse indignities with unwavering dignity. He thought of his training, which had taught him to recognize when a confrontation served his objectives and when it did not. Today, getting to Denver served his objectives. Everything else was a distraction. But as the beverage service concluded and the flight continued, Dominic could feel Amanda's attention returning to him periodically like a searchlight seeking a target. The first major confrontation had passed, but it had established a pattern, and in both his personal and professional experience, patterns tended to intensify before they broke. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are experiencing some light turbulence, the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. Please return to your seats if you are up and about and ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened. All electronic devices should be in airplane mode for the duration of the flight. The announcement echoed through the cabin as the plane encountered a patch of rough air, causing minor vibrations that rippled through the structure. Most passengers complied, automatically checking their devices or shifting them to airplane mode if they had not already done so. Dominic's phone was already properly configured, had been since before takeoff, and now rested in his pocket. He had finished his coffee and, despite the unpleasantness of the service interaction, had managed to read several chapters of the novel he had brought along. Bradley Wilson, however, had spent the last 20 minutes on his phone loudly conducting what appeared to be a business call despite the regulations against it. Listen, Thompson, I do not care what their offer is. We go in at 20% under not a penny more. They are desperate. By this time tomorrow we will own their entire catalog of properties. His voice carried through the cabin, drawing irritated glances from several passengers trying to rest or work. The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, slightly stronger this time. The overhead bins rattled. A few passengers gasped, but Bradley continued his call unabated, apparently believing himself exempt from both physics and airline regulations. Amanda Lawson moved purposefully down the aisle, ostensibly checking that all passengers were complying with the seatbelt sign. She passed at least 3 other passengers who were clearly using their phones, 2 texting, and 1 possibly on a silent video call with nothing more than a gentle reminder gesture. When she reached row 24, her demeanor shifted. She walked past Bradley, who was still loudly discussing negotiation tactics, and stopped directly beside Dominic's seat. "Sir, your phone needs to be in airplane mode immediately." Her tone was sharp, authoritative, and loud enough to draw attention. Dominic looked up at her, momentarily confused, since his phone was in his pocket. "My phone is in airplane mode," he replied calmly. "It has been since takeoff." "I can see you using it, sir." Amanda's voice rose slightly. "It is a federal violation to use cellular service while in flight." Sarah Goldstein looked up from her book, frowning at the accusation she knew to be false. Dominic had been reading quietly beside her for the past half hour, his phone nowhere in sight. "My phone is in my pocket," Dominic said, maintaining his composure. He slowly reached into his pocket and withdrew the device, holding it up to show the airplane mode icon clearly displayed at the top of the screen. "As you can see, it is in compliance with regulations." Amanda's expression tightened, a flicker of something, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps anger at being contradicted, crossing her features. But instead of acknowledging her error, she doubled down. "You must have just switched it," she insisted. "I saw you using it a moment ago." "That is not true," Sarah interjected, unable to remain silent in the face of such a blatant falsehood. "He has been reading his book for at least half an hour. His phone has been in his pocket." Amanda's gaze snapped to Sarah, then back to Dominic. "I do not appreciate your attitude, sir." "I do not have an attitude," Dominic replied evenly. "I am simply clarifying that my device is in compliance as requested." All the while, Bradley Wilson continued his loud business call, now discussing how to squeeze out the minority stakeholders, in some real estate venture, his voice carrying over the entire exchange. Amanda seemed to notice Bradley's call for the first time, or at least to acknowledge it publicly. She turned to him with a markedly different tone. "Sir, if you could please finish your call soon. We are experiencing turbulence and all devices should be in airplane mode." The contrast was stark. No accusations, no immediate demands, just a polite request couched in the gentlest possible terms. Bradley gave her a dismissive wave. Yeah, almost done. Critical business call." He made no move to end the conversation. Amanda nodded with a tight smile and turned back to Dominic, her expression hardening again. "I will be watching your compliance, sir. Further violations could result in a report to the captain." With that, she moved on, continuing her check of the cabin, but not confronting any other passengers using phones, several of whom were doing so openly. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "That was unbelievable," she whispered to Dominic. "She completely ignored the actual violation happening right next to you." Dominic nodded slightly, but said nothing. He had seen this pattern before, not just on planes, but in stores, on streets and restaurants. The automatic assumption of guilt, the higher standard of compliance, the disbelief when presented with evidence to the contrary. "You should complain." Sarah continued her academic's precision, giving way to genuine indignation. "This is textbook discrimination." "Complaining mid-flight rarely improves the situation," Dominic replied quietly. The wisdom came from experience, both personal and professional. Bradley finally ended his call with a loud, "We will crush them tomorrow. Book the steakhouse for 8. He turned to Dominic with a smirk. "Having trouble with the rules again." Dominic did not take the bait. He simply returned to his book, but his trained mind was cataloging every interaction, every inconsistency in treatment. Not because he planned to make an issue of it, he had far more important concerns waiting in Denver, but because observation was second nature after years at the Bureau. What he did not realize yet was that Sarah Goldstein had quietly slipped her phone from her bag and, keeping it below the level of the seat in front of her, had begun to record. Not for social media or public consumption, but as a private record of what she was witnessing. "Just in case," she murmured when she caught Dominic noticing. "This is not right." The plane continued its journey westward, the turbulence eventually subsiding. But the atmosphere in row 24 remained charged with an invisible tension, the accumulated static of bias looking for a place to discharge. 2 hours into the flight, the seatbelt sign finally switched off after an extended period of turbulence. A collective shifting rippled through the cabin as passengers stretched cramped limbs and contemplated visits to the lavatories. A small queue quickly formed in the aisle. Dominic had been waiting patiently for this opportunity. The coffee he had consumed earlier had long since made its presence known, and the extended seatbelt sign had forced him to practice the bladder control techniques he had learned during surveillance operations. Now, with the sign off and the aisle clearing slightly, he prepared to make his move. He turned to Bradley. "Excuse me, I need to get out." Bradley sighed dramatically, as if being asked to move was an unreasonable imposition rather than a basic courtesy of air travel. He made a show of closing his laptop, removing his headphones, and gathering his items, before standing to let Dominic pass. "Do not take too long," he said. "I have got work to finish before we land." Dominic stepped into the aisle and made his way toward the rear lavatories. Both were occupied with 3 people already waiting. He stood at the end of the informal queue, maintaining the expected distance for privacy and comfort. Amanda Lawson emerged from the galley area, pushing a cart of snacks for purchase. Her gaze swept the aisle, pausing when she spotted Dominic among those waiting. She left the cart and approached with swift determination. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately," she said, her voice carrying over the ambient noise of the cabin. Dominic gestured toward the lavatory queue. "I am waiting to use the restroom. The captain is expecting more turbulence soon. Return to your seat now, please." Her tone left no room for discussion, though the seatbelt sign remained off and no announcement had been made. "I have been waiting for the seatbelt sign to turn off for nearly an hour," Dominic explained reasonably. "I will be quick." Amanda's posture stiffened. "This is not a negotiation. Return to your seat." Dominic noticed that none of the other waiting passengers were being asked to leave the queue. In fact, a white businessman from first class had just walked past them all to use the forward lavatory without any comment from Amanda. "Is there a reason I am being singled out?" Dominic asked, keeping his voice level. "There are several other passengers waiting. Are you refusing to comply with crew member instructions?" Amanda's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "That is a federal violation, sir." Bradley Wilson had left his seat and now stood a few rows away, watching the exchange with undisguised interest. "Having more trouble with the rules?" he called out loud enough for several rows to hear. Dominic remained calm, though he felt the familiar tension that came with being unfairly targeted. "I am not refusing anything. I am simply asking why I am being asked to return to my seat while other passengers are permitted to wait." A middle-aged woman in the queue nodded in agreement. "We are all waiting here. The seatbelt sign is off." Amanda ignored her, focusing intently on Dominic. "Return to your seat now, or I will need to inform the captain." At that moment, James Peterson appeared from the forward cabin. He took in the situation with a quick glance and approached Amanda. "Amanda," he said quietly, "the captain has not called for the seatbelt sign. We are in smooth air right now." Amanda turned to him, speaking in a hushed but intense tone. "This passenger has been problematic since boarding. He is creating a disturbance." Dominic stood perfectly still, saying nothing. He was not raising his voice, not gesturing, not doing anything that could reasonably be construed as creating a disturbance. He was simply standing in line for the bathroom like several other passengers. James looked uncertain. "He seems to be just waiting for the lavatory." "Trust me," Amanda insisted. "I have been doing this job since before you were in high school. I know when someone is going to be a problem." The lavatory door opened and the next passenger in line entered. The queue moved forward. Dominic remained where he was, caught in an absurd standoff over one of the most basic human needs. "I really just need to use the restroom," he said quietly to James. "Then I will return directly to my seat." James seemed about to respond when Bradley Wilson stepped closer, inserting himself into the situation with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his opinion valued. "Listen, buddy," he said to Dominic, though he was performing for the small audience that had formed. "When the flight attendant gives you an instruction, you follow it. It is not that complicated. Some people just do not know how to act on a plane." Several emotions flashed across James's face: discomfort, uncertainty, and something that might have been shame. But before he could speak, Amanda seized the moment. "Thank you, sir," she said to Bradley. "It is refreshing to have passengers who understand the importance of following crew instructions." The second lavatory door opened. The line moved again. Now only one person stood between Dominic and the facilities he urgently needed. Dominic made a decision. "I understand your concern," he said to Amanda, his voice steady, "but I have been waiting for the lavatory for some time now. I will be very quick and then return directly to my seat." It was not a confrontation. It was a statement of basic human need and reasonable intent. Amanda's face flushed. Are you refusing a direct instruction from a flight crew member? I am going to use the restroom and return to my seat. Dominic replied, his voice still calm but firm. The last passenger ahead of him entered the lavatory. Now Dominic stood at the front of the queue. James, Amanda said sharply, go inform the captain that we have an uncooperative passenger. I want his decision on how to proceed. James hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the escalation of what should have been a non-event. Amanda, maybe we should... Go, she cut him off. Now. As James reluctantly headed toward the cockpit, the lavatory door opened. Dominic, maintaining eye contact with Amanda, simply said, "Excuse me," and entered the small compartment, closing and locking the door behind him. Inside the tiny space, he took a deep breath, centering himself. This situation was spiraling from absurd to potentially dangerous. He knew from his FBI training and experience how quickly these situations could escalate, how a minor confrontation could become a major incident, especially in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. He used the facilities quickly and efficiently, washed his hands, and prepared to return to his seat as promised. When he opened the door, he found Amanda waiting directly outside with Bradley Wilson hovering nearby. "The captain would like to speak with you," Amanda said, her tone suggesting she had won some victory. "After I return to my seat, as I said I would," Dominic replied, stepping past her and moving down the aisle. As he approached row 24, he noticed Sarah Goldstein watching intently. Her phone held low, but clearly recording. Several other passengers were watching as well, some with confusion, others with the uncomfortable expression of people witnessing an injustice but uncertain how to respond. Dominic slid back into his seat, nodded a quiet thanks to Sarah, and waited for whatever came next. He had faced far more dangerous situations in his FBI career, but few as pointlessly provocative as this one. Amanda and Bradley remained in the rear of the plane, engaged in a hushed but animated conversation. From his training in reading body language, Dominic could tell they were discussing him. Amanda gesturing in his direction, Bradley nodding with inappropriate familiarity for a passenger speaking to a crew member. James returned from the cockpit, his expression troubled. He joined Amanda and Bradley briefly before all three looked toward row 24. Something was being decided, something that had nothing to do with airline safety and everything to do with power prejudice and the dangerous assumptions people make based on appearance. Dominic took a deep breath and prepared for what would come next. Whatever happened, he would maintain his dignity. His mother had taught him that much. The FBI had taught him the rest: how to observe, document, and when necessary, respond to unjust provocation. The real conflict was about to begin. "Attention passengers," Captain Roberts' voice came through the cabin speakers, unusually formal. "This is your captain speaking. We are monitoring a situation in the cabin that requires our attention. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened until further notice. We appreciate your cooperation." A murmur of concern rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged confused glances. Some who had been dozing woke and looked around, trying to identify the situation referenced. Dominic remained still, his expression neutral, though he knew with certainty that he was the situation. He had experienced this before: the weaponization of authority against the innocent, based on nothing more than appearance and assumption. Amanda Lawson and James Peterson appeared at the front of the economy section. Amanda walked purposefully down the aisle, James trailing behind with visible reluctance. They stopped at row 24, and Amanda addressed Dominic with a voice loud enough to be heard several rows in each direction. "Sir, multiple passengers have reported that you have been making threatening gestures and comments. The captain needs to speak with you." The accusation hung in the air, so blatantly false that several nearby passengers visibly reacted with surprise. Dominic kept his voice level. "That is not true. I have not threatened anyone." Amanda's expression hardened. "We have witnesses who say otherwise." "Who?" Sarah Goldstein interjected, unable to contain herself. I have been sitting next to him the entire flight. He has not threatened anyone. Ma'am, please stay out of this, Amanda responded without looking at her. This is a security matter. Bradley Wilson, who had returned to his seat during the captain's announcement, now shifted to face Dominic, his expression a mixture of smugness and faux concern. I tried to warn you to follow the rules, he said, his voice pitched to Carrie. Some people just do not know how to behave on a plane. Understanding dawned on Dominic. Bradley was not just an entitled passenger. He was actively colluding with Amanda, providing the witness she needed for her fabricated security threat. I have not made any threatening gestures or comments, Dominic stated firmly, addressing not just Amanda, but the surrounding passengers. This accusation is completely false. James Peterson looked increasingly uncomfortable. He leaned toward Amanda, speaking in a low voice. Amanda, I have not received any passenger complaints about threats. Amanda turned to him sharply. I received them directly, and as senior crew member I have already informed the captain. More passengers were watching now, some confused, some concerned, some recording discreetly with their phones. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from the usual mild discomfort of economy travel to something more tense, the collective sensing of injustice unfolding. The captain has made a decision. Amanda continued, focusing on Dominic again. For the safety of everyone on board, we will be making an unscheduled landing to have you removed from the flight. The words hit like a physical blow. Dominic thought of his mother in the hospital waiting for him. He thought of the critical hours being lost. He thought of the profound injustice of what was happening. This is completely unreasonable, he said, his voice still controlled but firm. I have done nothing wrong. I have not threatened anyone. I have not violated any regulations. This is discriminatory treatment, and it is unacceptable. Are you refusing to cooperate? Amanda's tone suggested she was almost hoping for such a refusal. I am stating facts, Dominic replied. I have a right to travel without being falsely accused. I have a family emergency in Denver, and this delay could have serious consequences. Bradley Wilson scoffed. Everyone has an excuse. The rules apply to everyone. Sarah Goldstein had had enough. What rules? She demanded, her voice rising with genuine anger. He has not broken any rules. I have been sitting right here the entire time. Other passengers began to speak up as well. I did not see him threaten anyone, called a woman 3 rows back. He has been quiet the whole flight, added a man across the aisle. Amanda ignored them all. Sir, the decision has been made. We will be landing in Kansas City in approximately 20 minutes. You can either proceed cooperatively, or we can have security remove you upon landing. The choice is yours. Dominic weighed his options quickly, as he had been trained to do in crisis situations. He could reveal his FBI credentials, now potentially ending this farce immediately, but doing so would compromise years of training in maintaining cover and potentially impact the case he had been building. More importantly, it would let Amanda and Bradley escape the consequences of their actions, consequences they deserved to face not because of his position, but because what they were doing was fundamentally wrong. I will comply under protest, he said finally, but I want it on record that these accusations are false, discriminatory, and potentially illegal. Noted, Amanda replied with a thin smile that suggested his protest would go nowhere. As she and James moved back toward the front of the cabin, Dominic could hear the whispers, see the uncomfortable glances, feel the weight of yet another injustice added to the countless ones he had experienced throughout his life. Sarah leaned toward him, her voice low and intense. This is outrageous. I have been recording everything. I will be your witness. They cannot just throw you off a plane for being black. Thank you, Dominic replied quietly. But be careful. They might try to confiscate your phone. Sarah nodded, slipping her phone into an inner pocket of her jacket. I have been sending the clips to my cloud storage as we go. They are already saved. Bradley Wilson pretended to focus on his laptop, but Dominic could see the satisfaction in his posture and the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. He had participated in this injustice willingly, perhaps even eagerly. In his world, people like Dominic were problems to be removed, obstacles to be cleared from his path. The plane began its descent toward Kansas City. Dominic looked out the window at the approaching ground, at the distance still to Denver, at the delay that could mean missing crucial hours with his mother. A cold anger settled in his chest, not the kind that clouded judgment, but the kind that clarified it. The kind that had fueled his decision to join the FBI in the first place, to work within the system to change it. In exactly 18 minutes, everything would change. Amanda Lawson, Bradley Wilson, Captain Roberts. None of them knew what was coming. None of them understood that in trying to remove a perceived problem, they had created one far beyond their imagination. The wheels touched down on the Kansas City runway with a screech of rubber on concrete. Dominic Reynolds prepared himself for what would come next. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Roberts. We have landed at Kansas City International Airport to address a security situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Local authorities will be boarding to assist with the situation. We apologize for the inconvenience and expect to resume our journey to Denver shortly." The announcement was met with a mixture of sighs, groans, and whispers throughout the cabin. Many passengers glanced toward row 24, having figured out from the earlier confrontation who the situation involved. Dominic sat perfectly still, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Years of undercover work had taught him how to maintain composure when every instinct urged action. He was calculating, assessing, planning not just for his immediate situation, but for the accountability that would follow. The plane taxied to a remote stand, rather than a gate, a procedure typically reserved for genuine security threats. Through the window, Dominic could see 2 airport security vehicles approaching with lights flashing. Amanda Lawson appeared at the front of the cabin again, standing with a straight-backed authority as she addressed the passengers. "We apologize for this unscheduled stop," she announced. "Airport security will be boarding to remove a disruptive passenger. The rest of you will continue to Denver once this matter is resolved. We appreciate your patience." Her gaze fixed on Dominic as she spoke a subtle but unmistakable public identification of the disruptive passenger in question. Sarah Goldstein shook her head in disgust. "This is a complete abuse of power," she said loudly enough for nearby rows to hear. "He has not disrupted anything." Bradley Wilson turned to her with a condescending smile. "Maybe you missed something while you were working on your little spreadsheets. The professionals have made their decision." "What professionals?" Sarah shot back. "The flight attendant who has been targeting him since takeoff, or the businessman who thinks he owns the plane." A smattering of murmurs suggested some passengers agreed with her assessment. Others looked away uncomfortably, the bystander effect in full force, recognizing an injustice but unwilling to involve themselves. Captain Roberts emerged from the cockpit, a tall man with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to unquestioned authority. He conferred briefly with Amanda, who pointed toward row 24. The captain nodded and approached. "Sir," he addressed Dominic directly, "I have been informed of multiple disturbances you have caused during this flight. For the safety of all passengers, you will be deplaning here in Kansas City." Dominic met his gaze steadily. "Captain, I have caused no disturbances. These accusations are fabricated and discriminatory. I have a family medical emergency in Denver that cannot wait." The captain's expression remained impassive. "I understand you may feel that way, but my crew's assessment is what guides my decision. Airport security is boarding now to escort you off the aircraft." "Your crew's assessment is biased and false," Dominic replied, his voice firm but controlled. "I am being removed because of how I look, not because of anything I have done." Captain Roberts stiffened slightly. "I am not going to debate this. The decision is final." "At least check with other passengers," Sarah interjected. "I have been sitting right here. He has done absolutely nothing wrong." The captain glanced at her briefly. "Ma'am, we rely on our trained crew to assess security situations. It is not a democratic process. From further back in the cabin, a male voice called out, "I have been watching too. The man has not done anything." Another passenger, a woman in her 60s, added, "This whole thing seems very suspicious. Why is he being singled out?" Captain Roberts raised a hand for silence. "I understand your concerns, but the safety of this aircraft is my responsibility. My decision stands." The forward cabin door opened and 2 airport security officers boarded, one white, one Hispanic, both with the rigid posture of men who expected immediate compliance with their authority. The white officer, whose name tag read Mitchell, approached Captain Roberts. "We understand you have a situation requiring passenger removal." "Yes," the captain confirmed. "Row 24, middle seat. The passenger has been disruptive and uncooperative with crew instructions." Officer Mitchell nodded and moved down the aisle toward Dominic, followed by his partner, Officer Ramirez. The cabin had grown unusually quiet, the tension palpable as passengers watched the scene unfold. Mitchell stopped beside row 24. "Sir, you need to gather your belongings and come with us." Dominic looked up at him calmly. "I would like to speak with a supervisor before I am removed. These accusations are false." "That can be addressed at the terminal," Mitchell replied. "Right now you need to comply with the captain's decision to have you removed." "I have done nothing to warrant removal," Dominic stated firmly. "This is discriminatory treatment based on my appearance. I have a family emergency in Denver that cannot wait." Mitchell's expression hardened. "Sir, this is not optional. Either you come with us voluntarily or we will have to use necessary force. Which is it going to be?" The ultimatum hung in the air. Dominic knew his options were narrowing. He could reveal his FBI credentials now, but something deeper held him back. This was not just about him anymore. It was about a pattern of behavior that affected countless others who did not have a badge to protect them. What was happening to him now had happened to thousands of others who had no recourse, no protection, no justice. "I will come," Dominic said finally. "But I want it on record that I am being removed without cause and that I believe this is racial discrimination." "Noted," Mitchell replied, clearly uninterested. Bradley Wilson made a show of standing to let Dominic out, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and faux concern. "Should have followed the rules, buddy," he said just loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. As Dominic stood to retrieve his backpack from under the seat, Mitchell reached for it. "I need to check the contents before you take it," the officer stated. "My personal items are in that bag," Dominic replied. "There is nothing dangerous inside." "Standard procedure," Mitchell insisted, reaching again. Dominic carefully picked up the backpack himself. "I am happy to open it for inspection, but the bag remains in my possession." Something in his tone, the quiet authority perhaps, gave Mitchell momentary pause. But then the officer's training reasserted itself. "Hand over the bag, sir. Now." Around them, multiple passengers had their phones out, recording the escalating confrontation. Sarah Goldstein stood up despite the seatbelt sign still being illuminated. "This is wrong," she declared loudly. "He has done nothing to deserve this treatment." Officer Ramirez turned to her. "Ma'am, please sit down and fasten your seatbelt. Not until someone explains why this man is being removed when he has broken no rules and threatened no one," Sarah insisted. "Security matter," Ramirez replied curtly. "Sit down." By now, several other passengers were voicing their concerns. A low chorus of objections spread through the nearby rows. Amanda Lawson looked increasingly uncomfortable with the growing resistance. James Peterson stood further back, his expression clearly troubled by what was unfolding. "Last chance," Officer Mitchell said to Dominic. "Hand over the bag and come with us cooperatively." In exactly 6 minutes, these men would understand the gravity of their error. In exactly 6 minutes, everything would change. "I will come with you," Dominic said, his voice steady. "But my bag stays with me." Mitchell exchanged a glance with Ramirez, a silent communication of escalation protocols. Then, with practiced coordination, they moved. "Stop resisting." Officer Mitchell's command echoed through the cabin as he grabbed Dominic's arm. "I am not resisting," Dominic replied calmly, though Mitchell had twisted his arm into an uncomfortable position. "I am simply stating that my bag stays with me." The tension in the cabin had escalated from uncomfortable to alarming. Passengers watched in stunned silence as the two security officers maneuvered in the narrow aisle, positioning themselves on either side of Dominic. "Give me the bag," Mitchell demanded again, reaching for the backpack. "The bag contains important personal items," Dominic explained, still maintaining his composure. "I am happy to open it for inspection, but it needs to remain in my possession." What he could not say, what he would not say yet, was that the bag contained his FBI credentials service weapon and case notes, items that, if separated from him, could compromise both his identity and national security. "That is it," Mitchell declared. "Ramirez, take control of his other arm. We are doing this the hard way." Ramirez hesitated momentarily, perhaps sensing that something about this situation was not following the expected pattern. But training and hierarchy won out, and he moved to secure Dominic's left arm. "You are making a serious mistake," Dominic told them, his voice low but clear. "I am asking for a reasonable accommodation to keep my personal property with me. That is not resistance." Mitchell tightened his grip. "In my experience, people who say we are making a mistake are usually the ones who have made the mistake themselves." Throughout the confrontation, Dominic had not raised his voice, had not made any aggressive movements, had simply stated his right to maintain possession of his personal property, a right any passenger would expect, particularly when being removed from a flight under dubious circumstances. The first phones had started recording the moment the security officers boarded. Now nearly every passenger within sight had a device pointed at the unfolding scene. In the digital age, injustice had witnesses, thousands of them, potentially millions, once the footage spread. "I want to speak to your supervisor before this continues," Dominic said, still maintaining remarkable calm despite the escalating physical confrontation. "You can talk to whoever you want once we are off this plane," Mitchell replied. "Right now, you are coming with us." He nodded to Ramirez. "On 3. 1, 2. Stop." Sarah Goldstein had stood again, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is wrong. You cannot just manhandle someone who has done absolutely nothing. Ma'am, interfering with security personnel is a federal offense," Mitchell warned without looking at her. "Sit down now." Several other passengers had begun to vocally object as well. "He is not even resisting," called a man from across the aisle. "Why are they being so aggressive?" asked an older woman, her phone steadily recording. Amanda Lawson's expression had shifted from righteous certainty to growing concern as she witnessed the escalating situation and the passengers' reactions. Captain Roberts remained stoic, but a slight furrow in his brow suggested he might be reconsidering the wisdom of how this was unfolding. Bradley Wilson, perhaps sensing the turning tide, attempted to reassert the narrative. "He has been difficult the entire flight," he announced loudly. "Always arguing with the flight attendants, making people uncomfortable." Sarah rounded on him furiously. "That is a complete lie. You have been the one causing problems." As the verbal confrontation between passengers intensified, Officers Mitchell and Ramirez seized the moment to act. With practiced coordination, they forcibly pulled Dominic from his row, twisting his arms behind his back in a control hold designed for actively resisting subjects, though Dominic had offered no resistance beyond verbal objections. "Stop resisting," Mitchell shouted again, though it was clearly for the benefit of witnesses rather than a response to any actual resistance from Dominic. "I am not resisting," Dominic replied, his voice steady despite the uncomfortable position. "You are using excessive force against a compliant subject." The professional terminology caught Mitchell off guard momentarily, but he quickly recovered. We will determine what is excessive. Now move toward the exit. As they began to force Dominic up the aisle, his backpack still clutched awkwardly in his restrained hands, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically. What had begun as uncomfortable observation had transformed into active witnessing of perceived injustice. More passengers called out objections. Several stood from their seats despite the illuminated sign. A young man in his 20s who had been quietly filming suddenly stepped into the aisle ahead of them. Hey, everyone. I am live streaming this on TikTok right now. Over 6,000 people are watching this happen in real time. The information rippled through the cabin, changing the dynamic yet again. This was not just being recorded, it was being broadcast live. The accountability had jumped from future to immediate. Mitchell hesitated, then doubled down. Clear the aisle. This is a security matter. The young man whose name tag from a technology conference read Jordan Wells did not move. My followers want to know why this man is being removed when he is clearly not resisting, and multiple passengers are saying he has done nothing wrong. Ramirez looked increasingly uncertain. Mitchell, maybe we should do your job. Mitchell cut him off sharply. Clear the aisle, he repeated to Jordan. Captain Roberts finally stepped forward. Mr. Wells, please return to your seat. Security personnel need clear access to perform their duties. Jordan reluctantly stepped aside but continued his live stream narrating as he went. The captain is now supporting the removal despite multiple passengers stating that this man has done nothing wrong. Mitchell and Ramirez resumed moving Dominic toward the exit, their grips still unnecessarily tight on his arms. Dominic winced slightly as they twisted him to navigate the narrow aisle, the first sign of discomfort he had shown throughout the confrontation. Sarah Goldstein called out from behind them. I am Sarah Goldstein, Ph.D., MIT. I have been sitting next to this man the entire flight, and I am stating categorically that he has done absolutely nothing to warrant this treatment. This is textbook discrimination. Her academic credentials added weight to her testimony, causing more passengers to vocally support her assessment. The situation was spiraling beyond what Amanda Lawson had anticipated when she first targeted Dominic for removal. As they reached the forward cabin area, James Peterson stepped forward, his expression troubled. Officers, I am a flight attendant on this aircraft and I have not personally witnessed any threatening behavior from this passenger. Amanda whirled on him, her expression furious. James, that is completely inappropriate. But James stood his ground. I am just stating what I have observed, Amanda. Or rather, what I have not observed. Mitchell ignored the dissension among the crew. Keep moving, he ordered Dominic, shoving him toward the aircraft door. Dominic complied, but spoke clearly for the benefit of the many recording devices now trained on him. I am being removed from this flight without cause. I have threatened no one. I have violated no regulations. I have been singled out based on my appearance, and I am now being subjected to excessive force despite offering no resistance. His articulate statement, delivered calmly even while being physically manhandled, resonated through the cabin and across Jordan Wells's live stream, where the viewer count had now jumped to over 12,000 and climbing rapidly. As they reached the aircraft door, Dominic made one final statement to the watching passengers. Remember what you saw here today. This happens to people who do not have witnesses every day. Then they were through the door and onto the jet bridge, momentarily out of sight of the passengers. But now facing a new audience, the terminal was visible through the glass walls of the jet bridge where dozens of travelers had stopped to watch the unusual spectacle of a man being forcibly removed from an aircraft. Mitchell and Ramirez maintained their tight hold on Dominic's arms as they moved him along the jet bridge toward the terminal. Mitchell reached again for the backpack. I will take that now. No, Dominic replied simply. The bag stays with me. Mitchell's face flushed with anger at the continued defiance of what he perceived as his absolute authority. That is it. Put him on the ground, Ramirez. We are doing this by the book. In exactly 2 minutes, everything would change. But first, Dominic Reynolds would experience the full measure of unwarranted force that countless others had faced before him, those without badges, without witnesses, without recourse. The difference was that Dominic knew exactly what was coming next, and he was ready. "Down on the ground now." Officer Mitchell's command echoed through the jet bridge as he applied a pain compliance technique to Dominic's wrist, attempting to force him to his knees. Dominic, despite the shooting pain, remained upright through sheer determination. "This is unnecessary force," he stated, his voice strained but controlled. "I am not resisting." Mitchell increased the pressure, twisting Dominic's arm further behind his back. "On the ground, or it gets worse." Ramirez looked increasingly uncomfortable with the escalation but maintained his hold on Dominic's other arm, caught between professional obligation and growing doubt about the situation. Through the glass walls of the jet bridge, passengers in the terminal had stopped to watch, many with phones raised to record the confrontation. Inside the plane, passengers crowded around the windows, witnessing the excessive force being applied to a man who had shown no aggression. With a final violent twist, Mitchell succeeded in forcing Dominic to his knees. The backpack slipped from his grasp, landing on the floor of the jet bridge beside him. "Finally," Mitchell muttered, reaching for the backpack. "Do not touch that bag." Dominic warned, his tone shifting subtly, a note of authority emerging despite his physically compromised position. Mitchell ignored him, grabbing the backpack and unzipping the main compartment. "Let us see what was so important to—" His words cut off abruptly as he registered the contents. From within the aircraft, Sarah Goldstein had positioned herself in the doorway, continuing to record despite Amanda Lawson's attempts to close the door and isolate the incident. "Get back to your seat," Amanda demanded. "No," Sarah replied firmly. "This is wrong and everyone needs to see it." On the jet bridge, Mitchell had frozen his hand inside Dominic's backpack. The color drained from his face as he withdrew. Not contraband, not a weapon, but a leather wallet with a distinctive gold emblem clearly visible. "Ramirez," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Let him go, now." Ramirez, confused by the abrupt change, looked at his partner. "What? Let him go?" Mitchell enunciated each word carefully, holding up the wallet so Ramirez could see the FBI shield and identification clearly displayed. Ramirez immediately released his hold on Dominic's arm, stepping back as if burned. "Oh, shit." Dominic rose slowly to his feet, straightening his hoodie with a dignity that belied the violence he had just endured. He held out his hand for his credentials. "Special Agent Dominic Reynolds, Federal Bureau of Investigation." He stated, his voice carrying clearly to everyone within earshot, including the growing audience in the terminal and the passengers still watching from the aircraft. "You have just assaulted a federal officer in the performance of his duties." The transformation was immediate and stark. Mitchell's aggressive confidence evaporated, replaced by a sickly pallor. Ramirez took another step back, his hands visibly trembling. We were just following orders," Mitchell stammered. "The captain requested removal." "Following orders is not a defense for using excessive force against a compliant subject," Dominic replied, his professional training now fully evident in his speech and bearing, particularly when that subject is a federal agent. He reached into his pocket and withdrew his phone, tapping the screen to end a recording that had been running since the initial confrontation on the aircraft. "Every moment of this incident has been documented, from the initial false accusations through to the assault you just committed." Through the aircraft door, Amanda Lawson watched in horror as the situation she had instigated spiraled completely beyond her control. Captain Roberts stood behind her, his face ashen, as he processed the implications of what had just occurred. Bradley Wilson had pushed his way to the front of the curious passengers, but now his expression of smug satisfaction had transformed into one of dawning terror as he realized the magnitude of what he had participated in. Dominic secured his credentials and turned to face the aircraft door where the crew and several passengers were still watching. His voice carried easily across the space. "Captain Roberts, I need to speak with you immediately regarding the decision to remove a federal officer from this aircraft based on false accusations. Officer Mitchell. Officer Ramirez, do not leave this area. Additional federal agents will be arriving shortly to take your statements and review your body camera footage." As if on cue, the terminal doors opened and two professionally dressed individuals, a woman and a man, approached with purposeful strides. The woman, about 40 and Hispanic, took immediate control of the situation. "Special Agent Sofia Rivera, FBI Kansas City Field Office," she announced, displaying her credentials. "We received an alert about an agent in distress." Her gaze swept over the scene, taking in Dominic's disheveled appearance, the security officer's evident distress, and the audience of witnesses. "It appears we arrived just in time." The man with her stepped forward. "Special Agent William Taylor," he introduced himself. "Agent Reynolds, are you injured?" "Minor wrist strain from an inappropriate control technique," Dominic replied. "Nothing serious." Rivera nodded, then turned to the security officers. "Officers Mitchell and Ramirez, I need your body cameras and service weapons immediately. You are being temporarily relieved of duty pending investigation of assault on a federal officer." Mitchell looked as though he might protest, but one glance at Dominic's composed expression and the growing crowd of witnesses silenced whatever objection he had been about to make. Wordlessly, he removed his body camera and service weapon, handing them to Agent Taylor. Ramirez quickly did the same. "Agent Taylor will escort you to a secure area for preliminary questioning," Rivera instructed. "Do not discuss this incident with each other or attempt to contact anyone about it until you have been formally interviewed." As Taylor led the subdued officers away, Rivera turned her attention to the aircraft door, where Captain Roberts and Amanda Lawson stood frozen in a tableau of dawning consequences. "Captain Roberts, Ms. Lawson, you will also need to provide statements regarding your decision to remove Agent Reynolds from this flight. Please, step onto the jet bridge." The captain moved forward mechanically, his professional demeanor cracking under the weight of what had just occurred. Amanda followed, her earlier confidence replaced by visible dread. Inside the aircraft, passengers were openly discussing what they had witnessed, many still recording. Jordan Wells's TikTok livestream had now reached over 50,000 viewers, with comments flooding in faster than they could be read. The story was spreading in real time, beyond anyone's ability to contain it. Bradley Wilson attempted to slip away, moving toward the back of the crowded passengers, but Sarah Goldstein spotted him. "And do not forget Mr. Wilson," she called out loudly. "He provided false testimony about threats that never happened." Agent Rivera's sharp gaze found Bradley in the crowd. "Mr. Wilson, please join us on the jet bridge as well." Trapped by circumstance and witnesses, Bradley had no choice but to comply. He shuffled forward, avoiding eye contact with everyone, especially Dominic. As the key participants assembled on the jet bridge, Dominic addressed the remaining passengers still watching from the aircraft door. "I apologize for the delay in your journey. I assure you this matter will be resolved as quickly as possible so you can continue to your destination." His composed professionalism in the face of what he had just endured struck many of the witnesses powerfully. Here was a man who had been wrongfully accused, forcibly removed, and physically assaulted, yet maintained both his dignity and concern for others. Agent Rivera conferred briefly with Dominic, then addressed Captain Roberts. "Captain, your passengers will need to deplane temporarily while we secure statements from key witnesses. We will work with airline representatives to minimize the delay." Captain Roberts nodded stiffly, the full weight of the situation settling on him like a physical burden. "I will make the announcement." As Roberts returned to the aircraft to inform the passengers, Dominic turned to face Amanda Lawson and Bradley Wilson directly. His expression was not angry or triumphant. It was something more powerful, the calm certainty of justice in progress. "You did not see a federal agent," he said quietly. "You saw a black man in a hoodie. That is not just your mistake, that is your bias. And today, that bias just cost you everything. The words hung in the air, simple but devastating in their truth. Amanda seemed to physically shrink under their weight. Bradley looked away, unable to meet Dominic's gaze. The reckoning had begun. FBI, step back. Agent Rivera's authoritative command created an immediate perimeter around the group on the jet bridge. The terminal spectators, many still recording with their phones, quickly complied while maintaining their digital witness. Dominic Reynolds stood at the center of this unprecedented scene, his FBI credentials now displayed openly around his neck, the reality of his identity creating a seismic shift in the power dynamics that had defined the previous confrontation. Officer Mitchell remained pale, his earlier bravado replaced by the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose career was flashing before his eyes. Beside him, Officer Ramirez could not stop nervously adjusting his uniform as if physical composure might somehow mitigate the professional disaster unfolding around him. Agent Reynolds, Rivera addressed him with professional courtesy. Could you provide a brief summary of the events leading to this situation? Dominic nodded, his composure remarkable given the circumstances. I boarded transnational Flight 847 as a passenger traveling to Denver for a family medical emergency. Throughout the flight, I was subjected to a pattern of discriminatory treatment by senior flight attendant Amanda Lawson, supported by passenger Bradley Wilson. Amanda flinched at the direct naming, but did not interrupt. This included false accusations about my behavior, disparate enforcement of flight regulations, and ultimately fabricated claims of threatening behavior used to justify my removal from the aircraft. Captain Roberts authorized the removal based solely on these false claims without seeking corroboration from other passengers or crew members. Captain Roberts's jaw tightened, but he too remained silent as the summary continued. Upon landing in Kansas City, Officers Mitchell and Ramirez boarded the aircraft and proceeded to remove me using excessive force, despite my verbal compliance and lack of resistance. When I maintained possession of my backpack, which contains my service weapon and case files related to an active federal investigation, Officer Mitchell escalated to pain compliance techniques. The assault continued on the jet bridge until my FBI credentials were discovered. Rivera nodded, taking in the information with professional detachment. We will need detailed statements from everyone involved. Agent Taylor is already setting up in a private area of the terminal. Through the glass walls of the jet bridge, the scene had drawn considerable attention. Passengers waiting at nearby gates pressed against windows. Airport staff had gathered at the periphery whispering among themselves. And most significantly, the digital audience continued to grow exponentially as Jordan Wells's live stream was now being picked up by social media aggregators and news outlets. He is FBI? Are you serious? The exclamation came from a passenger who had just deplaned and overheard Dominic's summary. Others followed their reactions, a mixture of shock, vindication, and dawning outrage on his behalf. They dragged an FBI agent off the plane for being black, someone asked incredulously. I told you he was not doing anything wrong. Sarah Goldstein's voice carried from the group of deplaning passengers. I was sitting right next to him. The narrative was solidifying in real time, shaped by eyewitness accounts and the undeniable visual of Dominic's FBI credentials against his casual attire, the stark contrast between appearance and reality that had triggered the entire incident. Bradley Wilson, perhaps sensing the tide of public opinion forming against him, attempted to salvage his reputation. I simply reported what I thought was suspicious behavior, he said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. In today's security climate, if you see something, say something, right? Dominic turned to him, his gaze level. Mr. Wilson, you fabricated claims of threatening behavior that never occurred. That is not vigilance, that is filing a false report, and as you are about to learn, that has serious legal consequences. Bradley's attempted justification withered under the weight of Dominic's calm certainty. Amanda Lawson, whose 2 decades of experience in the airline industry were rapidly becoming worthless as the magnitude of her error became clear, finally found her voice. This is a terrible misunderstanding. She began, her tone shifting to conciliatory. Agent Reynolds, if I had known you were FBI... That is precisely the problem, Ms. Lawson. Dominic interrupted, his voice level but firm. You should not need to know I am FBI to treat me with basic dignity and fairness. The same rules should apply to everyone regardless of their appearance or position. The truth of his statement resonated through the growing crowd of witnesses. This was not just about one man's experience, it was about a pattern so pervasive that even a federal agent could become its victim. Agent Rivera, recognizing the situation was becoming a public spectacle, moved to regain control. We need to continue this in a more private setting. Captain Roberts, please ensure all passengers are deplaned in an orderly fashion. They will be directed to a waiting area where airline representatives can address their concerns about the flight delay. Roberts nodded stiffly and returned to the aircraft to manage the evacuation. As passengers began filing off the plane, many approached Dominic, directly offering words of support or apology for not intervening more forcefully. Sarah Goldstein handed him her business card. I have everything recorded, she assured him. MIT stands behind its data, and I have plenty. Jordan Wells, still live streaming, approached with the confidence of someone who knew they were capturing a viral moment. Agent Reynolds, my followers want to know what happens next. Will there be consequences for this clear case of discrimination? Before Dominic could respond, Agent Rivera stepped between them. Mr. Wells, while we appreciate your documentation of this incident, we need to conduct a proper investigation before discussing potential consequences. Could you please end your live stream now? Jordan hesitated, clearly reluctant to relinquish his growing audience. Dominic addressed him directly. Mr. Wells, your footage may be important evidence in ensuring accountability. But right now I need to focus on the investigation and, more importantly, getting to my family emergency in Denver. The mention of the family emergency, which many viewers had forgotten in the drama of the badge reveal, instantly changed the tone. Jordan nodded, understanding the human dimension beyond the viral content. All right, everyone. I am ending this stream now out of respect for Agent Reynolds' privacy. But remember what we witnessed today. This is what happens when we judge people based on appearance rather than actions. With that, Jordan finally ended the live stream that had, unbeknownst to him, already been clipped, shared, and reshared across multiple platforms, reaching hundreds of thousands of viewers. As the jet bridge cleared of passengers, Dominic found himself facing the core group responsible for his ordeal: Amanda Lawson, Bradley, Wilson, Captain Roberts, and the security officers. The power dynamic had completely inverted. Those who had wielded authority against him now stood powerless before federal jurisdiction. Agent Reynolds, Rivera said quietly, the Kansas City field office has arranged for a private flight to Denver for you. It will be ready to depart within the hour. Dominic nodded in appreciation. Thank you, but first I need to make a statement to these individuals. He turned to face them directly, his expression not vengeful but resolute. What happened today was not about airline security. It was not about passenger safety. It was about seeing a black man in casual clothes and making assumptions about who he was and what he was capable of. Those assumptions led to a cascading series of decisions that violated my rights, subjected me to public humiliation, and physically endangered me. He let the words sink in before continuing. I could have identified myself as FBI at any point, but I chose not to, because the treatment I received is the same treatment countless others face every day, people who do not have a badge to protect them once the truth is revealed. People who do not have the weight of a federal agency behind them when seeking justice. Amanda looked down. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. Captain Roberts maintained his rigid posture, but the strain showed in his face. Today you will all provide detailed statements. Body camera footage, aircraft, surveillance, passenger recordings, all of it will be reviewed, and then a determination will be made regarding both criminal charges and civil liability. Dominic straightened his hoodie, the same casual garment that had somehow marked him as suspicious from the moment he boarded. "I need to get to Denver now. My mother is waiting. But this is not over. What happened today will have consequences not just for you personally, but for the structures and attitudes that made it possible." With that, he turned to Agent Rivera. "I am ready to proceed to Denver now." As Dominic walked away, escorted by Rivera toward the terminal, he left behind a group of people whose lives had just fundamentally changed. They had attempted to exercise power over someone they judged as powerless. In doing so, they had walked straight into a reckoning none of them had seen coming. Behind them, through the glass walls of the jet bridge, dozens of phones remained pointed in their direction. The digital witnesses ensuring that what had happened here today would not be buried, ignored, or forgotten. The story was already spreading across social media platforms with the speed and force of a wildfire. Hashtags forming and multiplying, "Tired FBI on board," "Flying," "While black," "bias in the air." The revelation of Dominic's true identity was not just a moment of personal vindication. It was the beginning of a much larger conversation, one that would eventually reach boardrooms, training facilities, and policy discussions across the entire airline industry. "Clear the area, FBI business." Agent Taylor's voice cut through the murmurs of the gathered crowd, creating an immediate pathway through the terminal. The authority in his tone and the visible FBI credentials produced an instant response that contrasted sharply with the resistance Dominic had faced just minutes earlier. Dominic walked beside Agent Rivera, their matched strides and professional demeanor forming a visible unit that commanded respect without requiring demands. Behind them, Officers Mitchell and Ramirez followed under Taylor's supervision, their earlier swagger replaced by the subdued posture of men facing potential federal charges. Amanda Lawson, Bradley Wilson, and Captain Roberts brought up the rear of this unusual procession, flanked by additional airport officials who had arrived to manage the situation. The contrast was stark. The same man who had been forcibly removed from his seat now led the way, while those who had orchestrated his removal followed like chastened schoolchildren. In a private conference room off the main terminal, the Kansas City Airport Director Thomas Hernandez awaited them. His expression reflected the gravity of the situation: an FBI agent assaulted on his watch, a major airline involved, and social media already ablaze with footage. "Agent Reynolds," he greeted Dominic with appropriate deference. "On behalf of the Kansas City International Airport, I want to express our deepest apologies for this inexcusable incident." Dominic acknowledged the apology with a brief nod. "I appreciate that, Director Hernandez. Right now, my priority is continuing to Denver as soon as possible. I have a family emergency that cannot wait." "Of course," Hernandez replied. "We have a private aircraft standing by at Terminal C. My staff will escort you there immediately." Rivera interjected, "Before Agent Reynolds departs, we need brief preliminary statements from everyone involved. The full investigation will continue after his departure." Dominic checked his watch, calculating the time lost, and what remained before he could reach his mother's hospital bedside. "I can provide my statement now, but it needs to be expedited." The next 30 minutes unfolded with the efficiency that federal authority could command when necessary. Dominic delivered a concise but detailed account of the events, his training evident in the precision of his recall. Time-specific statements, exact descriptions of physical interactions. His professional testimony stood in sharp contrast to the nervous, self-justifying accounts that followed from Amanda Bradley and the others. Throughout this process, the power shift remained visibly evident. Those who had wielded authority against Dominic now deferred to him, their body language revealing their recognition of the catastrophic error they had made. Amanda Lawson's voice trembled as she attempted to explain her actions. "I was just following our security protocols. Passenger behavior that seems unusual or potentially threatening needs to be reported. I did not mean for it to escalate like this." "Ms. Lawson," Dominic responded evenly. "At what point did I exhibit threatening behavior? Be specific." she faltered. Well, there was a general sense of uncooperativeness. That is not a specific behavior, Dominic pointed out. Try again. Amanda's composure cracked further. You questioned my instructions about your bag. You argued about using the lavatory. I stated facts about my bag's position. I asked why I alone was being prohibited from using the lavatory when others were permitted to do so. Neither constitutes threatening behavior. I felt threatened, she insisted weakly. By what specific action? The silence that followed spoke volumes. There had been no threatening action, only the perception of threat created by bias. Bradley Wilson, recognizing the quicksand he had wandered into, attempted a strategic retreat. I may have misinterpreted certain interactions, he offered carefully. In the confined space of an aircraft, perceptions can be distorted. Mr. Wilson, Dominic addressed him directly, you specifically claim to have witnessed threatening gestures from me. What exactly did you see? Bradley's gaze dropped to the table. I might have overstated my observations. That is not an answer. What specific threatening gestures did you witness? After another uncomfortable silence, Bradley admitted, I did not actually see any threatening gestures. So you provided false information that led to a federal agent being forcibly removed from an aircraft, Dominic summarized. That is a federal offense, Mr. Wilson. The color drained from Bradley's face as the legal implications of his actions began to sink in. Captain Roberts, maintaining more composure than his colleagues, addressed his role directly. I made my decision based on crew reports, which is standard procedure. If those reports were inaccurate, then my decision was fundamentally flawed. I accept responsibility for not seeking additional verification. Dominic acknowledged this with a nod. It was not exoneration, but at least it was an honest assessment. Officer Mitchell attempted to justify his use of force. We were responding to a reported disruptive passenger. Our protocols dictate. I am familiar with airport security protocols, Dominic interrupted. They do not include pain compliance techniques for non-resistant subjects. They do not include ignoring verbal statements of compliance, and they certainly do not include assaulting a federal officer. Mitchell fell silent, his defense collapsing under the weight of Dominic's expertise and the damning body camera footage that would soon be reviewed. As the preliminary statements concluded, Director Hernandez approached Dominic. Agent Reynolds, your transportation to Denver is ready. An airport representative will escort you directly to the aircraft. Dominic stood gathering his backpack, the same one that had been the source of so much unnecessary conflict. Agent Rivera, Agent Taylor, I trust you will ensure a thorough investigation. Absolutely, Rivera assured him. And Director Mueller has been briefed on the situation. The Bureau stands fully behind you. This reference to the FBI director sent a visible ripple through the room. The incident had already escalated to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. As Dominic prepared to leave, Bradley Wilson made one final desperate attempt to mitigate his circumstances. Agent Reynolds, he called out, I want you to know that I have great respect for the FBI and the important work you do. This was all a terrible misunderstanding. Dominic turned to face him directly. Mr. Wilson, this was not a misunderstanding. This was bias in action. And what you are experiencing now, the fear, the uncertainty about your future, the sense that your fate rests in someone else's hands, that is what countless people feel every day when they are judged not by their actions, but by their appearance. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. The difference is that most of them do not get the satisfaction of seeing justice served. They do not get to watch as those who wronged them face consequences. They simply have to absorb the injustice and move on. Remember that feeling you have right now, Mr. Wilson. It might be the most valuable lesson you ever learn. With that, Dominic left the room, following the airport representative toward his waiting transportation. Behind him, he left a group of people confronting not just the professional and legal consequences of their actions, but the moral reckoning that comes with having one's biases exposed in the harsh light of justice. The authority had shifted completely. The badge had been revealed. And now, as Dominic Reynolds finally continued his journey to Denver, the full weight of federal accountability began to descend on those who had misjudged him so catastrophically. This is a Category 1 incident. Special Agent Sofia Rivera declared to the assembled team at the Kansas City Field Office's mobile command unit, which had been rapidly deployed to the airport. We have an assault on a federal officer, obstruction of justice, and potential civil rights violations. The response had escalated with remarkable speed. What had begun as a routine flight removal had transformed into a multi-agency federal investigation within minutes of Dominic Reynolds revealing his FBI credentials. In the executive conference room of Terminal B, now converted into a temporary FBI command center, Rivera addressed the key personnel assembled. Agent Taylor will lead the evidence collection team. All digital footage, aircraft, surveillance, body cameras, passenger recordings needs to be secured immediately. Nothing gets deleted. Nothing disappears. Taylor nodded, already coordinating with technical specialists who were gathering digital evidence from airport security systems and reaching out to passengers who had recorded the incident. Agent Patel, Rivera continued, turning to a forensic specialist. I want a complete analysis of the body camera footage from Officers Mitchell and Ramirez. Pay particular attention to use of force protocols and any discrepancies between their verbal commands and actual passenger compliance. On it. Patel confirmed, already receiving the secured devices from evidence technicians. Rodriguez, coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office. I want preliminary charging documents ready by end of day. The Bureau Director has made it clear this incident will receive the full attention and resources of the FBI. The mention of the Director's involvement underscored the severity with which the Bureau was treating the assault on one of their agents. What might have been dismissed as a routine security incident had transformed into a high-priority federal case with potential national implications. In a separate room, Amanda Lawson sat alone, her transnational airlines uniform suddenly feeling like a costume rather than the symbol of authority it had been just hours earlier. The door opened and Agent Rivera entered with a file folder. Ms. Lawson, Rivera began without preamble. We have just received your employment records from transnational airlines. 23 years of service, multiple commendations for attention to security protocols, and, she paused opening the folder, 17 passenger complaints specifically citing discriminatory treatment based on race, ethnicity, or religious appearance. Amanda's expression crumbled. Those complaints were investigated and dismissed by the airline. Yes, they were. That is part of what we will be examining, whether transnational has a pattern of dismissing valid discrimination complaints without proper investigation. I was just doing my job, Amanda insisted, though with less conviction than before. Security is our priority. Security is indeed a priority, Rivera agreed. But security based on actual behavior, not assumptions tied to appearance. The evidence suggests you targeted Agent Reynolds from the moment he boarded, despite no behavioral indications of threat. Amanda had no response to this, the truth of the accusation evident in her silence. In yet another room, Bradley Wilson was on his phone frantically calling legal contacts until Agent Taylor entered and calmly informed him that his phone was being temporarily confiscated as evidence. This is outrageous, Bradley protested. I am not under arrest. You cannot take my personal property. Mr. Wilson, you are a material witness in a federal investigation and potentially a subject of that investigation regarding false statements leading to the assault of a federal officer. Your communications regarding this incident are evidence. You can either surrender your phone voluntarily, or we can obtain a warrant and arrest you for attempted evidence tampering. Bradley's face paled as he realized the seriousness of his situation. Wordlessly, he handed over the device. Captain Roberts sat stoically in his interview room, his decades of command experience evident in his composed demeanor. When Agent Rivera entered, he addressed her directly. "I have provided my statement about the decision-making process that led to the removal request. I accept full responsibility for not verifying the claims made by my senior flight attendant." Rivera studied him carefully. "Captain Roberts, this is not just about one decision. Transnational Airlines has had 7 similar incidents in the past 2 years. Passengers of color removed from flights based on subjective assessments of threatening or disruptive behavior with no objective evidence to support those assessments." "I was not aware of that pattern," Roberts replied, his professional facade showing its first crack. "As captain, you have final authority over who remains on your aircraft. Have you received any training specifically addressing unconscious bias in security assessments?" Roberts hesitated. "We have general diversity awareness modules in our annual training, nothing specific to security decisions." Rivera made a note in her file. "That will be relevant to the broader investigation into airline practices." Back in the main command center, the investigation was expanding beyond the individuals directly involved. Special Agent in Charge Davidson had arrived from the Kansas City field office and was briefing Rivera on the broader implications. "The Bureau Director sees this as potentially significant beyond the individual case," Davidson explained. "There is interest in examining whether this represents a wider pattern of discriminatory security practices in the airline industry. Agent Reynolds' experience provides a unique opportunity to document these practices from the inside." Rivera nodded. "The social media aspect adds another dimension. Jordan Wells's TikTok livestream had over 200,000 viewers by the time it ended. Clips are already circulating across all major platforms. The hashtag FBI Onboard is trending nationally." "That is actually useful," Davidson noted. "It creates public pressure for accountability and makes it harder for anyone to sweep this under the rug." "What about Agent Reynolds?" Rivera asked. "He is en route to Denver now." "Yes, private bureau aircraft. He will arrive at Denver International in approximately 45 minutes. Local field office will provide whatever support he needs for his family situation." Davidson paused. "The director also made it clear that while the Bureau will pursue this case vigorously, Reynolds' family emergency takes precedence. No demands on his time until he indicates he is ready." "Understood," Rivera confirmed. The operation continued to unfold with the precision and thoroughness that characterized FBI investigations. Evidence was collected and cataloged. Witnesses were interviewed and their statements recorded. The legal groundwork for potential charges was established. Meanwhile, in the terminal, passengers from Flight 847 were being reaccommodated on other flights to Denver. Many were still discussing what they had witnessed, sharing their recordings, comparing their observations. The story continued to spread across social media news outlets, beginning to pick up on the trending hashtags and piece together the extraordinary series of events. Sarah Goldstein had just completed her formal witness statement when she was approached by a transnational airlines representative offering a first-class seat on the next flight to Denver and a travel voucher for future use. "No, thank you," she replied firmly. "I will take the next flight, but I do not want any special treatment from your airline. What I want is assurance that you are addressing the discriminatory behavior I witnessed today." The representative, clearly unprepared for this response, stammered something about taking all feedback seriously before retreating to handle less principled passengers. As the FBI response continued to unfold at Kansas City International Airport, Dominic Reynolds was crossing the Colorado state line, the private bureau aircraft beginning its descent toward Denver. His thoughts had already shifted from the confrontation behind him to the hospital room ahead to Eleanor Reynolds, the woman who had taught him to maintain his dignity in a world that too often denied it. The badge had been revealed. Justice was in motion. But for Dominic, the most important journey was just about to begin. As Dominic Reynolds hurried through the corridors of Rocky Mountain General Hospital, the consequences of the incident on Flight 847 were already reverberating across multiple lives and institutions, creating shock waves that would only grow stronger in the days to come. At Kansas City International Airport, Director Hernandez called an emergency press conference to address the situation that had exploded across social media and was now being covered by major news networks. Flanked by airport security officials, notably missing officers Mitchell and Ramirez, he faced a barrage of questions from reporters. The airport has placed the involved officers on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Hernandez announced, his tone grave. We are cooperating fully with the FBI and conducting our own internal review of security protocols. What happened today falls far short of our standards for professional conduct and equal treatment of all travelers. A reporter called out, Is it true that the officers used excessive force against an FBI agent they mistook for a disruptive passenger? I cannot comment on specifics while the federal investigation is ongoing. Hernandez replied diplomatically. However, I can confirm that an incident occurred involving a federal law enforcement officer traveling as a civilian passenger. The airport takes this matter extremely seriously. Another reporter pressed, Sources say the agent was removed solely based on his race. Is the airport acknowledging this was a case of racial profiling? Hernandez paused, weighing his words carefully. We are examining all aspects of this incident, including potential bias in security enforcement. If our review identifies discriminatory practices, they will be addressed immediately with policy changes and additional training. The careful corporate language could not disguise the gravity of the situation. An institution designed to ensure public safety had become the site of injustice captured on video and witnessed by thousands. At Transnational Airlines headquarters in Atlanta, an emergency executive meeting had been convened in the Crisis Management Center. CEO Victoria Hargrove faced her senior team with an expression that conveyed the severity of the unfolding public relations disaster. The videos are everywhere, reported the head of communications, scrolling through his tablet. Over 2 million views across platforms and growing exponentially. Major news networks have picked it up. #FBI on board and #flying while black are trending nationally. What about stock impact? Asked the CFO anxiously. Trading was down 8% when the market closed. After-hours trading suggests we will see double-digit declines when the market opens tomorrow. Hargrove took a deep breath. What do we know about the agent involved? The head of security consulted his notes. Dominic Reynolds, 42, 15-year veteran with the Bureau, specialized in domestic terrorism investigations. Impeccable record. He was traveling to Denver for a family medical emergency when our crew misidentified him as a security threat. Misidentified. Hargrove repeated the euphemism hanging awkwardly in the air. Let us be clear about what happened. Our employees racially profiled a black FBI agent, falsely accused him of threatening behavior, had him removed from our aircraft, and stood by while airport security physically assaulted him. Is that an accurate summary? The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed her assessment. Right, she continued. So our first priority is a direct, unequivocal public apology, no corporate speak, no evasion of responsibility. Second, Amanda Lawson and any other crew members directly involved are suspended pending investigation. Third, I want a comprehensive review of our training programs related to bias and passenger assessment protocols. What about legal exposure? Asked the General Counsel. Significant, Hargrove acknowledged. Prepare for both criminal charges related to filing false reports and civil litigation for discrimination. We are not fighting this. If Agent Reynolds pursues legal action, we settle quickly and fairly. The executives nodded, recognizing the futility of attempting to defend what was clearly indefensible, especially with multiple video recordings circulating worldwide. One more thing, Hargrove added. I want to personally call Agent Reynolds to apologize, find out where he is and set it up. Meanwhile, at the Kansas City field office, Bradley Wilson sat uncomfortably in an interview room, his attorney having just arrived after a frantic call. The gravity of his situation was becoming increasingly clear as Agent Taylor outlined the potential charges. Making false statements to airline personnel leading to the removal of a passenger is a federal offense, Taylor explained. When that passenger turns out to be a federal agent traveling in the course of his duties, the penalties increase significantly. We are also looking at potential civil rights violations. My client was simply reporting behavior he found concerning, the attorney interjected. He had no way of knowing. Mr. Wilson has already admitted in his preliminary statement that he did not actually witness any threatening behavior, Taylor cut in. He fabricated those claims. That is not vigilance. That is filing a false report. Bradley's face had lost all color. His attorney leaned over to whisper something, but Bradley was not listening. He was staring at his phone, which had been returned to him after data extraction. The screen showed an email from the board of directors at Wilson Financial Strategies. The subject line read, "Emergency board meeting regarding recent incident." His professional reputation, built over decades, was crumbling in real time. Social media users had already identified him from the viral videos. His name was appearing in news articles. Clients were calling the firm, threatening to take their business elsewhere. In the adjacent room, Amanda Lawson faced her own reckoning. Transnational's regional manager had arrived to inform her of her immediate suspension. "The company has to distance itself from your actions," he explained, not unkindly. "The evidence is... well, it is not looking good, Amanda. Multiple witnesses contradict your account of the passenger's behavior. The video footage is damning." "I've given 23 years to this airline," Amanda said quietly, the full weight of her situation finally sinking in. "I know. That is why I am here in person. But this is not something that can be explained away with a customer service seminar or a written reprimand. You had a passenger forcibly removed from an aircraft based on criteria that appear to be entirely related to his race and appearance. And he turned out to be an FBI agent." The reality hung in the air between them, inescapable and devastating. 23 years of service ending not with a retirement party, but with a security escort from an airport terminal and an emerging public identity as the face of discrimination in air travel. Officers Mitchell and Ramirez faced their own consequences. The airport security director had arrived to collect their badges and equipment. "This is a formality," he assured them, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Administrative leave while the investigation proceeds." "This is bullshit," Mitchell protested. "We were responding to the airline's request for removal. We followed procedures." The director's expression hardened. "The body camera footage shows excessive force against a compliant subject. That is not procedure. That is abuse of authority. And when that subject turns out to be an FBI agent with the full weight of the federal government behind him, you are both lucky you are not in custody right now." As these individual consequences unfolded, the broader implications were beginning to emerge. News analyses were already connecting this incident to a pattern of similar removals across multiple airlines. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements. Lawmakers were calling for congressional hearings on discriminatory practices in air travel. What had begun as one man's ordeal was rapidly transforming into a national conversation about bias authority and accountability. And it had all started because a flight attendant looked at a black man in a hoodie and saw not a human being with rights, not an FBI agent with authority, but a threat to be eliminated. The badge had been revealed. The power had shifted. And now the reckoning had begun. 2 days after the incident on Flight 847, the investigation had expanded far beyond the individuals directly involved, reaching into the corporate structures and policies that had enabled the discriminatory treatment of Dominic Reynolds. At the FBI's Kansas City field office, Special Agent Rivera stood before a digital evidence board displaying a complex web of connections. Around the conference table sat representatives from multiple agencies: the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the Department of Transportation. What began as an isolated incident has revealed a concerning pattern. Rivera explained, gesturing to the timeline displayed on the main screen. In the past 36 months, Transnational Airlines has removed 253 passengers for disruptive behavior or security concerns. Our preliminary analysis shows that 78% of those passengers were people of color, despite them representing only 38% of the airline's total passenger demographic. The FAA representative leaned forward. That is a statistically significant disparity. It gets worse, Rivera continued. When we cross-reference with actual reported incidents of genuine security threats, passengers attempting to access cockpits' physical altercations, credible bomb threats, the correlation with these removals is less than 2%. In other words, the vast majority of these removals were based on subjective assessments by crew members, not objective security threats. The DOJ civil rights attorney made notes on her tablet. This suggests a potential pattern of discriminatory enforcement. Have you identified any internal policies that might contribute to this? Rivera nodded to Agent Taylor, who took over the presentation. We have reviewed Transnational's crew training materials and security protocols. Their threat assessment guidelines include vague criteria such as passenger appears nervous, passenger asks unusual questions, and passenger displays atypical behavior. Those are incredibly subjective standards, the DOT representative observed. Exactly, Taylor agreed. Without specific behavioral metrics, these assessments default to individual crew members' personal biases. In Amanda Lawson's case, we have uncovered 17 prior complaints, specifically citing racial discrimination, all dismissed by the airline's internal review process. What about the captain's role? Asked the FAA representative. Captain Roberts has been cooperative, Rivera explained. He acknowledges relying solely on Lawson's assessment without seeking additional verification. Transnational's procedures actually discourage captains from questioning crew security assessments, citing concerns about undermining crew authority. The investigation had expanded beyond individual bias to reveal institutional failures, policies that enabled discrimination by design rather than by accident. What about Bradley Wilson? The DOJ attorney asked. His role seems unusual for a passenger. Taylor clicked to a new screen showing Wilson's background. Wilson is CEO of Wilson Financial Strategies. His firm manages over $2 billion in assets, including significant investments in the airline industry. He is a top-tier frequent flyer with Transnational averaging 200,000 miles annually. Our analysis of his social media history and emails retrieved from his devices shows a pattern of derogatory comments about minorities. So, not just a random passenger, but someone with status and influence within the airline's ecosystem, the DOT representative summarized. Precisely, Rivera confirmed. And that status gave his false claims about Agent Reynolds unwarranted credibility with the crew. The investigation had also expanded to the airport security response. Body camera footage from officers Mitchell and Ramirez had been analyzed frame by frame, revealing multiple violations of use of force protocols. Background checks had uncovered that Mitchell had 3 prior excessive force complaints during his military police career, before joining airport security complaints that should have been flagged during his hiring process, but somehow were not. We are also examining potential manipulation of passenger data, Taylor added, bringing up a new screen showing internal Transnational software interfaces. Transnational uses an algorithm called Passenger Watch that flags potentially problematic travelers based on past interactions, booking patterns, and other metrics. We have found evidence that certain racial and ethnic names trigger higher scrutiny scores in the system. The DOJ representative looked alarmed. That would constitute automated discrimination. We are still analyzing the code, Taylor cautioned, but preliminary review by our tech team suggests the algorithm was trained on historical removal data, which, given the pattern we have already identified, would inherently embed racial bias into the automated system. As the federal agencies coordinated their expanding investigation, Transnational Airlines was conducting its own internal review under intense public and regulatory pressure. CEO Victoria Hargrove had assembled a task force of external auditors and civil rights experts to examine every aspect of the company's training policies and procedures. The incident with Agent Reynolds was not an aberration, concluded Dr. Erica Washington, a leading expert on institutional bias brought in to lead the audit. It was the predictable outcome of policies that enable subjective assessments without accountability combined with insufficient training on unconscious bias. Hargrove nodded grimly. I want complete transparency here. No corporate cover-up. What specific changes do you recommend? Dr. Washington displayed a comprehensive reform plan on the boardroom screen. First, complete overhaul of the threat assessment protocols, specific observable behaviors, only no subjective criteria. Second, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing staff with regular recertification. Third, an independent review board for all passenger removals, including demographic tracking and pattern analysis. Cost estimates, asked the CFO reflexively. Hargrove fixed him with a stern look. That is not the primary concern right now. We are facing potential federal charges, civil litigation, and a massive loss of public trust. The cost of not fixing this is far greater. Meanwhile, the airport security apparatus at Kansas City International was undergoing its own reckoning. Director Hernandez had initiated a comprehensive review of hiring practices, training protocols, and use of force policies. The preliminary findings were troubling. Our de-escalation training is inadequate, admitted the training director during an emergency staff meeting. Officers receive 40 hours on restraint techniques, but only 4 hours on verbal de-escalation. That imbalance creates a predisposition toward physical resolution of conflicts. Hernandez rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of institutional failure. And what about supervision of officers with prior complaints? Virtually non-existent, the HR director acknowledged. Mitchell had 3 excessive force complaints in the past 18 months. Each was reviewed individually, but no one was tracking the pattern. The investigation continued to expand, revealing not isolated failures but interconnected weaknesses across multiple systems: airlines, airports, security protocols, training programs, and corporate oversight mechanisms. What had happened to Dominic Reynolds was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable outcome of institutional structures that enabled bias to flourish unchecked. And as the investigation expanded, so did the public conversation. News programs featured panels discussing discriminatory practices in air travel. Social media remained ablaze with personal accounts from travelers of color sharing similar experiences. Congressional representatives called for hearings. Civil rights organizations demanded accountability. The badge had been revealed. The investigation had expanded. And the structures that had enabled that moment of injustice were being exposed to unprecedented scrutiny, while institutions grappled with the fallout from Flight 847. Dominic Reynolds sat in a vinyl chair beside his mother's hospital bed, his hand gently holding hers as she slept. The steady beep of monitoring equipment provided a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts, which alternated between concern for her condition and processing the events of the previous day. His sister Janelle Reynolds entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. At 38, she shared their mother's sharp cheekbones and determined expression, though worry had carved temporary lines around her eyes. "How is she?" Janelle whispered, handing him a cup. "Stable," Dominic replied, keeping his voice low. "Doctor says the new medication seems to be working. Her heart rhythm is more consistent." Janelle nodded, taking the chair opposite him. For a moment they sat in the comfortable silence of siblings who did not need constant conversation to feel connected. Then she asked the question that had been hovering between them. "Are you okay? Really okay? I mean..." Dominic considered the question carefully, as was his habit. "Physically, yes. Some minor soreness from the restraint techniques. Nothing serious." I am not talking about physically, Dom. He sighed, looking down at his mother's hand in his, the hand that had guided him through childhood, that had held him through countless moments of injustice, similar to what he had experienced on that flight. It is complicated, he admitted finally. Professionally, I am managing it. The Bureau has been supportive. The investigation is proceeding efficiently. He paused. But personally, it is a reminder that the badge does not change how people see me initially. It just changes how they treat me after they know. Janelle nodded, understanding completely. They had both grown up with their mother's wisdom. The world may judge you by your skin, but you must never let that judgment define your worth. Have you seen the news? She asked. Some. I have been focused on Mom. It is everywhere, Dom. Your incident has triggered something. People are sharing their own stories. There is talk of congressional hearings. The airline's stock is tanking. Dominic took a sip of his coffee, considering this information. That was not my intention. I just wanted to get to Denver without being harassed. I know, but sometimes these things have a purpose beyond our intentions. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. A nurse entered with a tablet in hand. Mr. Reynolds, there is a call for you at the nurses' station. FBI Director Mueller. Dominic squeezed his mother's hand gently before standing. I will be right back, he assured Janelle. At the nurses' station, he took the secure line that had been established. Reynolds speaking? Agent Reynolds, came the distinct voice of the FBI director. How is your mother? Stable, sir. The doctors are cautiously optimistic. I am glad to hear it. Take all the time you need with your family. That is the priority right now. Thank you, sir. That said, I wanted to personally brief you on developments. The investigation has expanded significantly. We are seeing evidence of widespread discriminatory practices not just at transnational but potentially across multiple airlines. The Department of Justice is considering a broader industry inquiry. Dominic absorbed this information, understanding its significance. I see. Your testimony will be important, but as I said, family comes first. We will work around your schedule. I appreciate that, sir. One more thing, Reynolds. The transnational CEO has been trying to reach you, Victoria Hargrove. She wants to apologize personally. No obligation to take the call, of course. Dominic considered this. I will think about it, sir. After concluding the call, Dominic took a moment in the quiet corridor of the cardiac care unit, collecting his thoughts. His phone buzzed with a text from his FBI handler on the domestic terrorism case. Testimony postponed by judge's order. Security concerns following your exposure. New date, TBD. Stay safe. Another complication. The case he had spent nearly a year building, infiltrating the Sovereign Patriot Alliance, gathering evidence of their planned attacks, was now in jeopardy because his cover had been potentially compromised by the viral videos. His phone buzzed again. Sarah Goldstein, the MIT professor who had sat beside him on the flight, had sent an email. Agent Reynolds, I have been contacted by multiple news outlets about what I witnessed. I have not responded yet. I wanted to check with you first about how to proceed. What I saw was unequivocally wrong, and I want to help ensure accountability, but I do not want to complicate your situation or the investigation. Her thoughtfulness was a welcome counterpoint to the chaos of the past 24 hours. He made a mental note to respond after checking with Rivera about the investigation's public communication strategy. Returning to his mother's room, Dominic found her awake, her eyes clear and focused despite her condition. There is my boy, Eleanor Reynolds said softly, her voice weaker than usual, but still carrying the warmth that had always been his anchor. Hey, Mom, he replied, resuming his seat and taking her hand. How are you feeling? Better now that you are here. She studied his face with the perception that had always seen through his composed exterior. Something happened. I can see it in your eyes. Dominic exchanged a glance with Janelle, who shrugged as if to say, You cannot hide anything from Mom. There was an incident on my flight, he acknowledged. I'm fine, just a misunderstanding. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. Dominic James Reynolds, do not you edit your truth for my benefit. Despite everything, he smiled. Even in a hospital bed, recovering from heart complications, his mother remained indomitable. It was more than a misunderstanding, he admitted. I was removed from the flight because of how I looked. It escalated, and eventually I had to identify myself as FBI. Eleanor nodded slowly, unsurprised. And how are you handling it? Professionally. I did not ask how the FBI is handling it. I asked how you are handling it. The distinction was important and typical of his mother's insight. How was he, Dominic the man, not Dominic the agent, processing this experience? I am angry, he admitted finally. Not just for myself. For everyone who experiences this without a badge to protect them. For every person who gets removed from a flight or followed in a store or pulled over driving through the wrong neighborhood who does not get the satisfaction of seeing the look on their accuser's face when they realize they have made a terrible mistake. Eleanor squeezed his hand with surprising strength. Use that anger, not to burn, but to illuminate. It was one of her familiar sayings, a piece of wisdom she had shared with him since childhood. Anger as a torch, not a weapon. A light to expose injustice, not a fire to consume the self. I am trying, Mom. I know you are. That is why you joined the Bureau, is it not, to change things from within, to be part of the solution? She paused, her breathing slightly labored from the extended conversation. This incident, it is not just about you. It is about all of us. Do not let them minimize it to an unfortunate misunderstanding or hide behind policy. Make them face it. Dominic nodded, drawing strength from her clarity and conviction. Even now, she was guiding him, helping him find his path through the complex intersection of personal pain and professional responsibility. Get some rest, Mom, he urged gently, seeing the fatigue in her eyes despite her strong spirit. I will be right here. As Eleanor drifted back to sleep, Dominic's phone vibrated again. A text from Agent Rivera. Transnational CEO making public statement in 30 minutes. Might want to watch. He found the remote and turned on the small television mounted in the corner of the hospital room, muting the volume and activating closed captioning to avoid disturbing his mother. Janelle moved her chair closer to see the screen. Together they watched as Victoria Hargrove, CEO of Transnational Airlines, stepped up to a podium bearing the company logo. Her expression was grave, her posture that of someone prepared to take responsibility rather than deflect it. Behind her stood a diverse group that included civil rights leaders and industry experts. Good afternoon, she began. I am here to address the inexcusable incident that occurred on Transnational Flight 847. As the statement unfolded, direct, unequivocal in its acknowledgement of fault and specific in its commitments to reform, Dominic felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of him recognized this as a necessary first step toward accountability. Another part understood that corporate statements, however sincere, could not erase the experience of being judged, removed, and physically assaulted based solely on appearance. What are you thinking? Janelle asked quietly. Dominic considered the question as he watched Hargrove outline comprehensive changes to training policies and accountability mechanisms. I am thinking about what Mom always told us. It is not enough to acknowledge injustice. You have to dismantle the structures that enable it. Janelle nodded, her gaze moving from the television to their mother's sleeping form. She raised us right. She did, Dominic agreed. And that is why, when she is better, I am going to make sure this incident leads to real change. Not just apologies and training videos, but fundamental reform in how the industry operates. As Eleanor Reynolds slept peacefully, her children maintained their vigil, both drawing strength from her lifetime of wisdom and courage. And though he had not planned it, though it had not been his intention, when he boarded that flight to Denver, Dominic Reynolds found himself at the center of a national conversation about bias, accountability, and the long path toward true equality. The personal struggle continued alongside the public one, intertwined but distinct. And as he had throughout his life and career, Dominic would navigate both with the dignity and determination his mother had instilled in him from the beginning. The cardiac care unit at Rocky Mountain General Hospital operated with a rhythm as steady as the heartbeats it monitored. Nurses moved efficiently between rooms, checking vital signs and administering medications. Doctors conducted their rounds, reviewing charts and speaking in the measured tones of those accustomed to delivering both hope and caution. Dominic had been at his mother's bedside for nearly 36 hours, leaving only briefly for necessities. The anxiety of the journey, both the original flight and the eventual arrival via FBI transport, had given way to the focused concern of a son watching over a parent's recovery. Dr. Melissa Chen entered the room, tablet in hand, her white coat crisp despite the late hour of her shift. She nodded a greeting to Dominic and Janelle before turning her attention to Eleanor. "Mrs. Reynolds, your latest EKG is showing improvement." She reported, her tone professional but warm. "The arrhythmia is responding to the medication. Your heart is finding its rhythm again." Eleanor, more alert now after hours of rest, responded with characteristic directness. "In plain English, doctor, am I dying?" Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "Not today, Mrs. Reynolds. Not if I have anything to say about it." "Good, because I have unfinished business." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Dominic. "Including making sure my son does not let what happened to him get buried in bureaucracy and corporate damage control." Dr. Chen glanced at Dominic curiously. "I am sorry I am not familiar." "Mom," Dominic began, "the doctor probably does not—" "Turn on the TV," Eleanor instructed firmly. "Channel 8. Janelle complied, raising the volume slightly. On screen, a news anchor was mid-sentence, continues to generate national discussion. The FBI has confirmed that Special Agent Dominic Reynolds was removed from Transnational Airlines Flight 847 after being falsely accused of threatening behavior in what many are characterizing as a clear case of racial profiling. The incident, captured on multiple videos, has sparked renewed calls for accountability in airline security practices. The screen split to show an interview with a civil rights attorney. What makes this case particularly significant is that it happened to a federal agent. It forces us to confront the reality that even the most official credentials, the highest level of professional status, does not protect people of color from bias-based assumptions and treatment. Dr. Chen's expression registered recognition and surprise. She turned to Dominic. "That is you. You are the FBI agent from the news." Dominic nodded, somewhat uncomfortable with the attention but understanding the significance of the moment. "Yes, it happened yesterday on my way here. I have been seeing it all over social media," Dr. Chen said, her professional distance momentarily giving way to genuine concern. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Dominic assured her. "My priority has been getting here to my mother." Eleanor reached for Dominic's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone in her condition. "He is being modest, doctor. My son was assaulted by airport security after being falsely accused by airline staff, and instead of making a scene or immediately identifying himself as FBI, he documented the discrimination so it could be properly addressed." "Mom," Dominic protested gently, "that is not exactly—" "It is exactly what happened," Eleanor insisted. "You have always been strategic even as a boy, thinking 3 steps ahead." Dr. Chen's pager buzzed, calling her to another patient. "I need to go, but Mrs. Reynolds, your condition is improving steadily. We will continue to monitor closely, but I am cautiously optimistic." She turned to Dominic. "And Agent Reynolds, for what it is worth, I am sorry for what you experienced. It is, unfortunately, familiar to many of us." The shared understanding in her last comment lingered after she left the room, the unspoken recognition between people who had experienced the subtle and not so subtle manifestations of bias in their professional and personal lives. Janelle muted the television as the news transitioned to another story. They have been covering it nonstop. Jordan Wells, the TikTok guy who was live streaming, is up to about 2 million followers now. He has become the unofficial narrator of the whole situation. Dominic shook his head slightly, still adjusting to the public dimension of what had been for him a deeply personal experience. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Agent Rivera. He excused himself to take it in the corridor. "Reynolds," he answered. "How is your mother?" Rivera asked, first maintaining the Bureau's commitment to prioritizing his family emergency. "Improving. Doctor is cautiously optimistic." "Good to hear. I am calling with an update on the investigation. The U.S. Attorney has approved preliminary charges against Officers Mitchell and Ramirez for assault on a federal officer and civil rights violations. Amanda Lawson is being charged with filing a false report. Bradley Wilson as well." Dominic absorbed this information, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction at the accountability and recognition of the difficult road ahead for all involved. "Transnational's legal team has reached out about a settlement," Rivera continued. "They are eager to resolve this without prolonged litigation. The terms being offered are substantial." "It was never about money for me," Dominic replied. "I know. But the settlement includes structural reforms, independent oversight of their security protocols, and a complete overhaul of their training. The money is almost secondary to the institutional changes they are committing to. This was more significant. Send me the details when you can. I will review them after my mother's condition stabilizes further." "Of course. One more thing, your testimony in the Sovereign Patriot Alliance case has been rescheduled with enhanced security protocols. The exposure from this incident has not compromised your undercover work as much as initially feared. The task force believes we can proceed with appropriate precautions." "That is good news," Dominic acknowledged. The case represented months of dangerous undercover work infiltrating a domestic terrorism group. The prospect of it being derailed by the flight incident had been a major concern. After concluding the call, Dominic returned to his mother's room to find her watching the news again, this time featuring an interview with Sarah Goldstein, the MIT professor who had sat beside him on the flight. "I want to be very clear," Sarah was saying to the interviewer, her academic precision evident even in this context. "What I witnessed was textbook discrimination. Agent Reynolds did absolutely nothing to warrant suspicion or removal. The contrast in how he was treated compared to other passengers was stark and unmistakable." Eleanor nodded approvingly at the screen. "I like her. Direct, honest." "She was recording everything," Dominic explained. "Even before it escalated. She recognized what was happening from the first interaction." "Because she was paying attention," Eleanor noted. "That is what we need more of, people who pay attention and then speak up." Janelle, who had been checking her own phone, looked up with an expression of disbelief. "The transnational stock has dropped 17% since the market opened this morning. They have lost over $1 billion in market value in less than 2 days." Eleanor made a sound that was half scoff, half satisfaction. "Hit them where they feel it. The bottom line often speaks louder than moral arguments." A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A hospital administrator entered, looking somewhat uncertain. "Agent Reynolds, I'm sorry to intrude, but there is a situation developing in the lobby. Several news crews have arrived. They are requesting statements about your experience. Hospital security is keeping them outside, but I wanted to make you aware." Dominic frowned. "Thank you. Please inform them that I am here for my mother's health situation and will not be making any statements at this time." The administrator nodded. "Of course. We will ensure your privacy is protected during your stay." After she left, Eleanor fixed her son with a knowing look. "You will have to address it eventually, Dominic. This is not going away." "I know, Mom, but right now, you are my priority. And you are mine," which is why I am telling you this matters. What happened to you happens to countless others without your resources, without your badge, without your platform. You have an opportunity here not just to seek justice for yourself, but to create change that helps others. It was classic Eleanor Reynolds, always seeing beyond the personal to the structural, always connecting individual experiences to larger patterns. Even from a hospital bed recovering from cardiac complications, she remained focused on justice and community. "When you are stronger," Dominic promised. "For now, rest." Eleanor smiled, settling back against her pillows. "I raised you right," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed as the medication and natural fatigue pulled her toward sleep. "Both of you." As his mother rested, Dominic's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Agent Reynolds, this is Victoria Hargrove, CEO of Transnational Airlines. I understand your priority is your family right now. When you are ready, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you directly about what happened and how we are addressing it. No press, no lawyers, just a direct conversation." Dominic showed the message to Janelle, who raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to respond?" "Not yet," he decided. "But eventually, yes. Mom is right. This is not just about me. It is about creating real change in how these systems operate." Through the hospital window, Dominic could see news vans in the parking lot below, their satellite dishes raised like technological flowers seeking signal. The story continued to spread, to generate discussion, to force a conversation that was long overdue. And at the center of it all, in a quiet hospital room in Denver, a family held its own conversation about justice, responsibility, and the long arc of change. Eleanor Reynolds might be the patient, but she remained the moral compass guiding her children, as she always had, with wisdom born of experience and an unshakable belief in the possibility of a more just world. The morning after Dominic's arrival in Denver, the media landscape had transformed. What began as viral video clips had evolved into a full-scale national conversation, spanning news networks, social media platforms, and political discourse. In the hospital cafeteria, Dominic sipped mediocre coffee while watching a wall-mounted television. CNN was featuring a panel discussion titled "Bias in the Air: The Reynolds Incident and Beyond." The screen showed a split image of his FBI credential photo alongside still frames from the viral videos of his removal. What makes this case particularly significant, a civil rights attorney on the panel was explaining, is that it strips away the usual excuses. This was not about behavior. Multiple witnesses confirm Agent Reynolds was completely calm and compliant. It was not about security. He posed no threat whatsoever. This was purely about a black man in casual clothes being perceived as dangerous, despite all evidence to the contrary. A former airline executive attempted to offer context. "We have to remember that flight crews make split-second security assessments in a high-stakes environment." "With respect," interrupted a transportation security expert, "that argument does not hold water here. This was not a split-second assessment. This was a prolonged pattern of discriminatory treatment that escalated over hours, culminating in a physically violent removal based on fabricated claims. The crew had ample time to evaluate actual behavior rather than rely on biased assumptions." Dominic's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Rivera. "Just FYI, the hashtag #FBIOnboard has generated over 12 million impressions in the past 24 hours. Major outlets requesting interviews with you. No pressure to respond, just keeping you informed." Another text followed almost immediately, this one from his FBI supervisor. "Director wants you to know there is no pressure for public statements. Bureau's official position is that you should focus on your family situation. Everything else can wait." The support from the Bureau had been unwavering, a fact Dominic appreciated, while recognizing that not everyone in similar situations had institutional backing during times of crisis. He finished his coffee and was about to return to his mother's room when a breaking news alert flashed across the television screen. The Transnational Airlines Board of Directors had just announced the indefinite suspension of Amanda Lawson pending a full investigation. Additionally, they had accepted the resignation of their vice president of customer experience, citing a failure of leadership in training and accountability. The corporate consequences were mounting rapidly. Transnational's stock continued its freefall, with financial analysts predicting potential long-term damage to the airline's brand and market position. As Dominic navigated the hospital corridors back to the cardiac care unit, he passed a waiting area where visitors were gathered around another television. This one showed footage from a spontaneous protest at Denver International Airport, where several dozen people carried signs reading, "Flying while black should not be a crime," and "Accountability at 30,000 feet." The story had transcended the specific incident to become a focal point for broader concerns about discrimination in transportation and beyond. Social media users were sharing their own experiences of being profiled on flights, in airports, on trains, and in other public spaces. When Dominic returned to his mother's room, he found her awake and engaged in conversation with Dr. Chen, who was completing her morning rounds. "Your mother's heart rhythm has stabilized significantly," Dr. Chen reported with cautious optimism. "The medication is working as intended." "When can I go home?" Eleanor asked directly. "If this improvement continues, possibly in 2 to 3 days. We will want to monitor you for at least 48 more hours to ensure the arrhythmia does not return." After Dr. Chen left, Eleanor gestured toward the television in her room, which was tuned to a local Denver station currently featuring an interview with Jordan Wells, the TikTok influencer whose live stream had helped bring the incident to national attention. "Your story has become something bigger than either of us anticipated," Eleanor observed. Dominic nodded, taking his usual seat beside her bed. "It seems to have struck a chord." "Because it happened to an FBI agent," she noted with the directness that characterized her approach to life. "When it happens to ordinary people, particularly those without the resources to fight back, it rarely makes the news." "I know, Mom. Which is why, when I am out of here, we need to make sure this momentum leads to actual change. Not just for transnational, not just for airlines, but for how these institutions operate more broadly." Janelle arrived with fresh coffee and pastries, having learned that hospital food left much to be desired. "Have you seen this?" she asked, showing Dominic her phone screen. It displayed a Washington Post headline, "Congressional Hearings on Airline Discrimination Scheduled Following Reynolds Incident." The story was expanding beyond media coverage to potential legislative action. Representatives from the Congressional Black Caucus had called for formal hearings to investigate patterns of discriminatory treatment in commercial aviation, citing the Reynolds incident as a tipping point that demanded federal oversight. "It is moving fast," Dominic observed. "Because it is visible," Eleanor replied. "Because there is video evidence that cannot be denied or explained away. Because a professional with impeccable credentials, you experienced something that confirms what so many have been saying for years." Dominic's phone rang. Agent Taylor from Kansas City. "Reynolds, we have identified a pattern in Transnational's passenger removal data. When we cross-referenced against their internal communication system, we found that Amanda Lawson had a removal rate for passengers of color nearly 6 times higher than the company average." "Not surprised," Dominic replied, "but it is good to have the data." "There is more," Taylor continued. "Bradley Wilson has a history with the airline. He has filed 8 complaints about suspicious passengers in the past 3 years. All described individuals matching similar profiles, young men of color in casual clothing. All resulted in passenger removals or heightened scrutiny." This additional context helped explain the unusual dynamic Dominic had observed between Amanda and Bradley on the flight, not a random convergence of bias, but a pattern of cooperation in targeting certain types of passengers. As the day progressed, the media coverage intensified. Cable news chyrons declared, "FBI agent profiled on flight sparks national debate," and "Transnational faces backlash over discriminatory removal." Social media timelines filled with reaction videos, commentary from public figures, and first-hand accounts from others who had experienced similar treatment. By evening, the transnational CEO had announced the creation of an independent review board to examine all passenger removals from the past 5 years, with a commitment to transparency in publishing the findings and implementing reforms based on the results. The story had moved beyond the specific incident to become a referendum on accountability bias and the experiences of people of color in public spaces. And while Dominic had not sought this spotlight, had in fact simply wanted to reach his mother's bedside without incident, he recognized that sometimes change required a catalyst. Eleanor, watching the continuing coverage with the critical eye she had applied to social issues throughout her life, summed it up with characteristic insight. They thought they were removing a problem passenger. Instead, they exposed a problem system. The media explosion continued uncontained and uncontrollable, forcing a conversation that was long overdue, not just about one flight or one airline, but about the daily reality of navigating spaces where one's appearance could trigger assumptions, actions, and consequences that had nothing to do with actual behavior and everything to do with deeply entrenched bias. And in a hospital room in Denver, Dominic Reynolds witnessed the unfolding national conversation while maintaining his focus on what mattered most, his mother's recovery, and the values she had instilled in him throughout his life. 6 weeks after the incident on Flight 847, Dominic Reynolds sat in a Washington, D.C. conference room, reviewing his testimony for the congressional hearing scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. Beside him, Department of Justice attorneys provided last-minute guidance on the scope and structure of the questioning he could expect. The committee chair has assured us they will focus on the institutional patterns rather than sensationalizing your personal experience, explained Elisa Morales, the lead DOJ attorney. But be prepared for some representatives to pursue more emotionally charged lines of questioning. Dominic nodded, adjusting his tie. After weeks in casual clothes at his mother's bedside, the formal suit felt slightly constraining, though appropriate for the gravity of the proceedings. Remember, you are testifying not just as the subject of the incident, but as an FBI professional with expertise in behavioral assessment, Morales continued. Your ability to analyze the event from both perspectives is uniquely valuable to this investigation. The journey from hospital room to congressional hearing room had been unexpected but purposeful. Eleanor Reynolds, now recovered and back home in Baltimore, had encouraged her son to embrace the opportunity to create meaningful change. Your experience can be the doorway to reform, she had told him. Walk through it with your head high. Outside the Rayburn House office building, demonstrators gathered with signs supporting increased accountability in the airline industry. News crews positioned their cameras for the day's proceedings, which promised to be among the most widely watched congressional hearings of the year. Inside the hearing room, representatives from major airlines, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Department of Transportation, and civil rights organizations prepared to testify alongside Dominic. The incident on Flight 847 had expanded into a comprehensive examination of industry practices, revealing patterns that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. At precisely 10:00 a.m., the committee chair called the hearing to order. Today, we examine troubling patterns of discriminatory treatment in commercial aviation brought to national attention through the experience of FBI Special Agent Dominic Reynolds. Cameras flashed as Dominic was called as the first witness. After being sworn in, he delivered his opening statement with the measured precision that characterized his professional approach. I appear before you today not primarily as an FBI agent, but as an American citizen who experienced firsthand how bias can override reason, how appearances can trump behavior, and how the structures designed to ensure safety can instead enable discrimination when not properly implemented and overseen. He proceeded to detail the events of Flight 847 chronologically, clinically, without emotional embellishment, but with unwavering clarity. The committee members listened intently, several taking detailed notes. What is most important to understand, Dominic emphasized, is that my experience, while personally troubling, is far from unique. The only unusual aspect was the revelation of my professional identity, which forced acknowledgement of an error that might otherwise have been dismissed or minimized. Countless Americans face similar treatment without the protection of a badge or the support of a federal agency. The questioning began with the committee chair. Agent Reynolds, in your professional assessment, at what point did this incident transition from potential procedural issues to clear discriminatory treatment? Dominic considered the question carefully. The pattern was evident from the first interaction regarding my properly stowed backpack. The flight attendant bypassed multiple passengers with similar or more pronounced violations to specifically target me. This selective enforcement established a baseline of disparate treatment that escalated throughout the flight. A representative from Michigan followed up. You have mentioned that you chose not to immediately identify yourself as an FBI agent. Can you explain that decision? 2 reasons, Dominic replied. First years of training in maintaining cover during investigations has instilled caution about revealing my identity unnecessarily, but more importantly, I recognized that revealing my credentials would likely end the incident for me personally, but do nothing to address the underlying pattern that affects many others without such protection. The hearing continued for over 3 hours, with Dominic's testimony followed by presentations from the FAA regarding oversight mechanisms, airline executives addressing their internal policies, and civil rights experts contextualizing the patterns within broader societal structures. Victoria Hargrove, CEO of Transnational Airlines, offered a direct apology to Dominic before outlining the comprehensive reforms her company had implemented since the incident reforms that went far beyond the typical corporate response of additional training videos and revised policy documents. We have completely restructured our security assessment protocols, removing subjective criteria entirely, Hargrove explained. We have implemented mandatory external review of all passenger removals with demographic data tracked and published quarterly for transparency, and we have created an independent passenger advocacy office with authority to override crew decisions in potential cases of discriminatory enforcement. The most powerful testimony came from ordinary travelers who had experienced similar treatment but lacked Dominic's resources and platform. Their accounts established the pattern that transformed the incident from an unfortunate anomaly to a revealing window into persistent structural issues. As the hearing adjourned for the day with additional sessions scheduled to examine specific policy recommendations, Dominic met briefly with the DOJ attorneys to review the day's proceedings. Your testimony was extremely effective, Morales assured him, factual, measured, but uncompromising on the key issues. What happens next? Dominic asked. The committee will draft recommendations for legislative action. Several airlines have already proactively implemented reforms to avoid potential regulation. The DOT has opened a formal investigation into industry-wide practices, and the civil cases are proceeding against the individuals directly involved. Those civil cases had taken shape in the weeks following the incident. Amanda Lawson faced not only termination from Transnational, but potential liability for filing false reports. Bradley Wilson's financial empire had begun to crumble as clients withdrew their investments following the publicity surrounding his role in the incident. Officers Mitchell and Ramirez had been terminated from airport security with criminal charges pending for excessive use of force. The consequences were not about vengeance, but accountability, a distinction Dominic had emphasized throughout the process. The goal was not to punish individuals, but to correct the structures that enabled and sometimes encouraged their actions. As Dominic left the Rayburn building, reporters called out questions, cameras capturing his composed exit. He had agreed to a single interview the following day, a thoughtful conversation rather than a sensationalized account to ensure the public understanding of the issues extended beyond the dramatic moments captured in the viral videos. That evening in his hotel room, Dominic called his mother to update her on the day's proceedings. You did good, Eleanor told him after he described the hearing. You kept the focus where it belongs on the patterns, not just the people. On the structures, not just the symptoms. "I had a good teacher," Dominic replied. "You have always been a quick study," Eleanor acknowledged. "But this work is not finished. Legislative hearings are important, but change happens in daily practice in consistent accountability and shifting the underlying assumptions." "I know, Mom. This is just the beginning." And indeed, as Dominic prepared for the second day of testimony, he understood that the official proceedings, however comprehensive, were just one component of the broader transformation needed. The incident on Flight 847 had opened a door, but walking through it would require sustained effort from institutions, individuals, and the public demanding better. The badge had been revealed. The proceedings were underway, and the long work of reform had begun in earnest. 3 months after the congressional hearings, the airline industry was experiencing an unprecedented period of self-examination and external pressure. What had begun with one incident on one flight had catalyzed a transformation that few had predicted in its scope and intensity. In the boardroom of Transnational Airlines Atlanta headquarters, CEO Victoria Hargrove presided over the quarterly meeting of the newly established Passenger Equity and Safety Council. Unlike traditional corporate advisory boards composed primarily of executives, this council included civil rights attorneys, behavioral scientists, passenger advocates, and most significantly, individuals who had experienced discriminatory treatment on commercial flights. "The implementation of the Reynolds Protocol has been completed across all domestic routes," reported the Chief Compliance Officer. "International route integration will be finished by the end of the month." The Reynolds Protocol, named without Dominic's input, but with his reluctant approval, established specific observable behavioral criteria for security assessments, removing subjective elements that enabled bias to influence decision-making. It required multi-level verification before any passenger removal and mandated comprehensive documentation of all security incidents, including demographic data, to track patterns. "The preliminary results are encouraging," the officer continued. "Passenger removals have decreased by 62% overall, with the racial disparity in removal rates reduced by 87%. Hargrove nodded, though her expression remained serious. "And the independent audit results?" A consultant from the civil rights law firm contracted to provide external oversight presented her findings. "We have reviewed all passenger removals from the past quarter. In 97% of cases, the documentation supports the action taken based on specific behavioral criteria. The remaining 3% have been flagged for further review and potential remediation." This level of transparency and external accountability was unprecedented in the industry. What made it particularly notable was that Transnational had implemented these changes voluntarily, getting ahead of the regulatory requirements that were still being developed at the federal level. Across the industry, other airlines had recognized the shifting landscape and taken similar, if sometimes less comprehensive, steps. The Reynolds effect, as industry analysts had termed it, had transformed the competitive dynamics. Airlines now touted their fairness metrics alongside their on-time performance and customer satisfaction scores. At Denver International Airport, a new training facility had opened specifically focused on evidence-based security assessment and de-escalation techniques. The curriculum, developed in consultation with behavioral scientists and civil rights experts, was being adopted by airports nationwide. "We are retraining every frontline employee," explained the facility director to a group of visiting airline executives. "The core principle is simple but profound focus on observable behavior, not assumptions based on appearance." In the facility's simulation lab, security officers practiced scenarios designed to test their ability to distinguish genuine security threats from behaviors influenced by travel stress, cultural differences, or medical conditions. Every assessment was recorded, reviewed, and scored based on adherence to evidence-based protocols. The Federal Aviation Administration had established a specialized division focused exclusively on equity in security enforcement. Their quarterly report, just published, showed promising trends across the industry, though with significant variations between airlines and regions. "The data shows improvement," noted the FAA administrator in a press conference, "but also reveals areas requiring continued attention." Some airlines have embraced comprehensive reform, while others have implemented more superficial changes. Our role is to establish consistent standards that passengers can rely on, regardless of which carrier they choose. The Department of Transportation had implemented new reporting requirements, mandating that all airlines track and publish data on passenger removals, including demographic information and the specific behaviors that triggered security intervention. This transparency created both public accountability and the ability to identify patterns requiring further investigation. For Bradley Wilson, the consequences had been professionally devastating. His firm, Wilson Financial Strategies, had lost over 60% of its clients in the weeks following the incident. His board of directors had forced his resignation, rebranding the company to distance it from his tarnished reputation. His application for membership renewal at his exclusive country club had been quietly denied. Amanda Lawson had faced her own reckoning, though, with an unexpected dimension. After her termination from Transnational, she had initially retreated from public view, but 6 weeks later, she had emerged with a public statement that surprised many. "I have spent my career believing I was ensuring passenger safety," she wrote in an open letter published in several major newspapers. The Reynolds incident forced me to confront the role that unconscious bias played in my assessments and decisions. This does not excuse my actions, but it has prompted a painful and necessary period of self-examination. Lawson had subsequently begun working with anti-bias training programs, sharing her experience as a case study in how seemingly objective security concerns could mask discriminatory assumptions. Her willingness to acknowledge her errors and work toward reform had not erased the consequences of her actions, but had added a layer of complexity to the narrative. Officers Mitchell and Ramirez had pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for cooperation with the broader federal investigation into security practices. Both had lost their certifications and would never work in law enforcement again. Mitchell had relocated to another state seeking anonymity after his name and image had become synonymous with excessive force. Ramirez had enrolled in a community college program studying social work in what he described as an effort to understand the human impact of authority misused. For Captain Roberts, the consequences had been professional rather than legal. While he had avoided criminal charges due to his reliance on established protocols, his airline had implemented new guidelines requiring captains to personally verify security concerns before authorizing passenger removals. His authority remained intact, but was now balanced by specific accountability measures. The industry reckoning extended beyond individual airlines to the broader ecosystem of air travel. Airport vendors received enhanced training on equitable customer service. TSA agents underwent additional modules on bias-free security assessment. Even airport lounge staff were included in initiatives to ensure consistent treatment of all eligible travelers. What made this reckoning particularly notable was its depth and breadth. Unlike previous cycles of public outrage followed by minimal change, the Reynolds incident had triggered sustained attention and concrete reforms. The combination of irrefutable video evidence, the revelation of Dominic's FBI credentials, and the broader societal context had created conditions for meaningful transformation. In a quiet office at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., Dominic Reynolds reviewed the quarterly report from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, detailing the changes implemented across the airline industry. The data suggests substantial improvement, noted Assistant Director Jenkins, who had overseen the Bureau's involvement in the broader investigation. But the real test will be sustainability, whether these changes persist once public attention inevitably shifts elsewhere. Dominic nodded, thinking of his mother's wisdom about the difference between reaction and reform. That is why the structural changes are so important. Individual training programs come and go, but rebuilding the assessment frameworks and creating ongoing accountability mechanisms, that is where lasting change happens. Your perspective has been invaluable throughout this process, Jenkins acknowledged. Few agents could have navigated both the personal experience and the professional analysis with such clarity. Dominic's phone buzzed with a text from Janelle. Mom, watching the DOT press conference, says to tell you it is a good start. He smiled slightly. Eleanor Reynolds was not easily impressed. Her standard for meaningful change was high as it should be. The industry reckoning continued imperfect but substantive, driven by a combination of public demand, regulatory oversight, legal liability, and corporate recognition that equity was now a competitive necessity in the marketplace. What had begun with bias and a badge had evolved into a case study in how incidents could become inflection points for institutional change when the right conditions converged. And for Dominic Reynolds, watching the transformation unfold while continuing his FBI duties, the experience reinforced what his mother had taught him throughout his life, that systems could change when enough people insisted that they must. 1 year after the incident on Flight 847, Dominic Reynolds stood in his mother's kitchen in Baltimore, chopping vegetables for Sunday dinner. Eleanor, fully recovered from her heart condition, supervised with occasional gentle corrections to his technique. "You still rush the onions," she noted, demonstrating the proper dicing method. "Patience yields better results." Dominic smiled, adjusting his approach. "Some lessons take longer to learn than others." The past year had brought numerous changes, both professional and personal. After the conclusion of the congressional hearings and the implementation of the initial industry reforms, Dominic had returned to his FBI duties, including successful testimony in the Sovereign Patriot Alliance case that had led to multiple convictions for domestic terrorism plotting. His role at the Bureau had evolved to include occasional consulting on bias-free security assessment protocols, sharing his expertise with other law enforcement agencies seeking to improve their training and procedures. It was not a formal reassignment, but a natural extension of his experience and the insights it had generated. "Sarah Goldstein called yesterday," Eleanor mentioned as she checked the roasting chicken. "She has been invited to speak at that airline training facility in Denver. She wanted to know if you would consider joining for a panel discussion." Sarah had remained in contact throughout the past year, her academic perspective on bias in security assessments proving valuable in developing the reformed protocols. Her recordings from the flight had been critical evidence in both the legal proceedings and the policy reforms that followed. "I told her I would think about it," Dominic replied. "The Bureau has been supportive of limited public engagement on these issues, but I am careful not to become the face of the reforms. This cannot be about one incident or one person." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "The work matters more than the recognition." Their conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Janelle arrived with her husband and their 2 children, who immediately enveloped their grandmother in enthusiastic hugs. Sunday dinner at Eleanor's had been a family tradition for years, interrupted only by work obligations or, most recently, her health challenges. As the family settled around the dining room table, the conversation flowed naturally between everyday matters and reflections on the past year's events. Dominic's nephew Miles, a perceptive 10-year-old, had questions about the changes in airline security that he had heard discussed. "Uncle Dom, did they really name those new rules after you?" he asked. Dominic smiled slightly. "They did, though I did not ask them to. What matters is that the rules help make things fairer for everyone." "Does that mean people will not get kicked off planes for no reason anymore?" The directness of children often cut to the heart of complex issues. "The goal is to make sure decisions are based on what people actually do, not what they look like or what others assume about them," Dominic explained. "It is not perfect yet, but it is better than it was." Eleanor watched this exchange with quiet pride. Her son had transformed a personal injustice into a catalyst for broader change, just as she had taught her children throughout their lives. After dinner, while the others cleaned up, Dominic stepped onto the back porch for a moment of quiet reflection. His phone buzzed with a message from Agent Rivera, who had led the initial FBI response to the incident. "Thought you would want to know the Reynolds Protocol is being adapted for implementation across all federal law enforcement agencies. DOJ announcement coming this week." This expansion beyond the airline industry represented a significant evolution of the reforms potentially affecting millions of interactions between authorities and the public. The implications were substantial not just for security assessments, but for the fundamental relationship between those who wielded power and those subject to it. Eleanor joined him on the porch, intuiting his contemplative mood. "Good news?" she asked, noticing the phone in his hand. He shared Rivera's message. Eleanor considered it with characteristic thoughtfulness. "You know what matters most about this," she said finally. "It is not that they named it after you. It is that your experience helped create something that will protect people who do not have your advantages. People without badges, without institutional support, without the platforms to make their stories heard." Dominic nodded, his mother's wisdom as clarifying as ever. "That is what I have tried to focus on throughout this process. It was never about personal vindication. Though I imagine that moment when you showed your FBI credentials had a certain satisfaction to it," Eleanor added with a knowing smile. Dominic laughed softly. "I will not deny that." The setting sun cast long shadows across the small, well-tended garden where Eleanor had taught her children to grow both vegetables and values. The metaphor was not lost on Dominic, the careful cultivation required for both plants and principles to flourish. "I have been thinking about taking some personal leave," he mentioned. "The Sovereign Patriot case is closed and my current assignment is wrapping up. I have not had a real break in years." "That sounds wise," Eleanor agreed. "Where would you go?" "I was thinking about that flight to Denver," Dominic replied. "The one I never completed." Eleanor understood immediately. A form of reclamation, finishing what was interrupted. Exactly. Not out of fear or trauma, but as a deliberate choice. On my terms this time. Inside, the sounds of family conversation and laughter created the backdrop for this moment of personal resolution. Dominic had processed the incident professionally throughout the investigations hearings and reform implementations. But this quieter, more personal integration was equally important, acknowledging the experience without being defined by it, learning from it without being limited by it. "I think that is a fine idea," Eleanor said, patting his hand gently. "Just remember to call when you land." A month later, Dominic boarded a commercial flight to Denver, not for a family emergency this time, but for the personal journey he had described to his mother. He wore similar casual clothing to what he had worn that day on Flight 847, a deliberate choice rather than a coincidental one. The flight experience was noticeably different. The security assessment at the gate was professional and behavior-focused. The flight attendants maintained consistent standards for all passengers. When he used the lavatory, no one questioned his movement through the cabin. These were small things, perhaps unremarkable to many travelers. But to Dominic, they represented the tangible results of the changes implemented over the past year. Changes sparked by his experience, but expanded through the collective efforts of many individuals and institutions committed to more equitable practices. As the plane began its descent into Denver International Airport, Dominic reflected on the journey, not just the physical travel from Baltimore to Denver, but the more complex path from injustice to reform, from individual experience to institutional change. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Safe landing." He smiled, typing his reply, "Safe landing," on all fronts. The personal resolution had come not through forgetting or minimizing what had happened, but through transforming it into something constructive, something that would benefit countless others facing similar situations without his advantages or platform. And in that transformation lay the most meaningful resolution of all. 5 years after the incident on transnational Flight 847, a new class of flight attendants gathered in the training center at the National Aviation Academy in Washington, D.C. The room buzzed with the energy of professionals embarking on careers in an industry that had undergone significant transformation in recent years. "Today we begin your training in the Reynolds assessment protocols," announced the instructor, a veteran flight attendant with 20 years of experience. These protocols represent the current gold standard for evidence-based security assessment in commercial aviation. On the screen behind her appeared a photograph of Dominic Reynolds, not the FBI credential photo that had circulated during the original incident, but a more recent image of him speaking at an international conference on equitable security practices. The protocols are named after Special Agent Dominic Reynolds of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the instructor explained. In 2025, Agent Reynolds experienced discriminatory treatment while traveling as a civilian passenger, culminating in his forcible removal from a flight based entirely on biased assumptions rather than actual behavior. Video clips from the incident played on the screen carefully selected to demonstrate the problematic interactions without sensationalizing the more dramatic moments. The instructor used them as teaching tools, identifying specific points where subjective assessments had replaced objective observations. What began as one incident on one flight has transformed industry standards worldwide, she continued. The Reynolds protocols are now implemented by 94% of international carriers and required by regulatory authorities in 57 countries. The legacy of Flight 847 had indeed extended far beyond its initial impact. The reforms initially implemented at transnational airlines had spread throughout the industry, refined by ongoing research data analysis and collaboration between security experts, civil rights advocates, and behavioral scientists. In airports around the world, the practical effects were visible in daily operations. Security assessments followed structured protocols with specific behavioral indicators. Passenger removals required multi-level verification and documentation. Independent oversight ensured accountability and identified emerging patterns requiring attention. Transnational airlines, initially at the center of the controversy, had transformed itself into an industry leader in equitable security practices. The reforms implemented in the aftermath of the Reynolds incident had become a competitive advantage, attracting passengers who valued both safety and fairness in their travel experiences. The legacy extended beyond procedures and protocols to the broader culture of air travel. Passengers of all backgrounds reported more consistent treatment. Crew members described greater confidence in their security assessments, knowing they were based on evidence rather than assumptions. The data showed both improved security outcomes and reduced discriminatory impacts, demonstrating that these goals could be complementary rather than competing. At FBI headquarters, Dominic Reynolds, now a supervisory special agent, led a specialized unit focused on developing bias-free assessment techniques for law enforcement agencies. His experience had positioned him uniquely to bridge the worlds of security implementation and civil rights protection. Understanding both the legitimate needs of security personnel and the profound impact of biased enforcement on individuals and communities. The key insight from our research, he explained to a class of new agents, is that reducing bias does not compromise security, it enhances it. When we focus on actual behavior rather than assumptions based on appearance, we identify genuine threats more accurately while reducing false positives that waste resources and undermine public trust. The unit's work had influenced law enforcement practices well beyond the FBI, with local police departments, federal agencies, and international partners adopting variations of the assessment frameworks originally developed for aviation security. The Reynolds Legacy Fund, established anonymously by Victoria Hargrove, but named with permission, provided grants for implementing these reforms in jurisdictions with limited resources. Eleanor Reynolds, now in her late 70s but still sharp and engaged, had become an unexpected voice in the ongoing conversation about equitable security practices. Her perspective as the mother of the FBI agent at the center of the incident brought a humanizing dimension to discussions often dominated by technical and legal considerations. What happened to my son was not just about one flight or one airline, she told a congressional committee during follow-up hearings on the 5th anniversary of the incident. It was about the choices we make as a society, whether we allow fear and bias to guide our actions or insist on systems that protect both safety and dignity for everyone. The individuals directly involved in the incident had followed various paths in the years since. Amanda Lawson had continued her work with anti-bias training programs, her first-hand account of how bias had influenced her perceptions and decisions, providing a powerful case study for others in positions of authority. She would never work in aviation again, but her willingness to acknowledge her errors and contribute to preventing similar situations had given her life an unexpected new purpose. Bradley Wilson had never recovered professionally from his role in the incident. His financial firm had collapsed, his reputation irreparably damaged. He had relocated to a small town in another state, occasionally giving interviews that vacillated between grudging acknowledgement of his errors and attempts to minimize his responsibility. He remained for many a cautionary tale of how quickly privilege could collapse when abused too blatantly. Officers Mitchell and Ramirez had largely disappeared from public view after serving probationary sentences for their roles in the physical confrontation. Mitchell had reportedly struggled with alcohol dependence and employment instability. Ramirez had completed his education in social work and found a position with a community organization focusing on conflict resolution, his experience serving as a personal motivation for helping others find nonviolent solutions to tense situations. Sarah Goldstein had incorporated the incident into her academic research on bias in decision-making, publishing several influential papers and eventually a book titled Observable Behavior: The Science of Equitable Assessment. Her role as a witness had transformed into that of an expert contributor to the reforms that followed. Jordan Wells, whose TikTok live stream had helped bring the incident to public attention, had leveraged his increased following to focus on social justice issues. His advocacy had matured from viral content creation to substantive documentation of both ongoing problems and successful reforms. The legacy of Flight 847 was multifaceted technical protocols and training programs, cultural shifts and accountability mechanisms, individual reckonings, and institutional transformations. What had begun as a moment of injustice had evolved into a catalyst for change that affected millions of travelers and increasingly citizens interacting with various forms of authority in their daily lives. At Denver International Airport, a small plaque in the main terminal marked the location where the FBI had met transnational Flight 847 5 years earlier. The inscription was simple. From this site emerged the Reynolds Protocols transforming how we balance security and equity in public spaces. A reminder that justice requires both vigilance and vision. Dominic had not requested the memorial and had been somewhat embarrassed when informed of its installation, but he understood its purpose not to celebrate him personally, but to mark a moment when the revelation of a badge had created an opportunity for meaningful change. As new flight attendants learned the protocols that bore his name as security officers applied bias-free assessment techniques, as passengers of all backgrounds experienced more consistent treatment. The legacy continued to evolve. It was not perfect, no human system could be, but it represented substantial progress toward the balance of safety and dignity that had seemed so elusive on that day 5 years earlier. And for Dominic Reynolds, continuing his FBI work while occasionally consulting on the ongoing refinement of the protocols, the most meaningful legacy was not the procedures or even the improved experiences of countless travelers. It was the fulfillment of his mother's wisdom shared during those days in the hospital when the incident was still fresh. Use your anger not to burn, but to illuminate. And the badge had been revealed. The light had spread, and the path forward remained illuminated by that moment of revelation, guiding the ongoing journey toward more just and equitable practices in aviation and beyond. In the quiet moments after the incident on Flight 847, few could have predicted how far-reaching its impact would become. What appeared to be a routine passenger removal, one of hundreds that occur across the airline industry each year, transformed into a watershed moment that reshaped policies, practices, and perspectives. The revelation of Dominic Reynolds' FBI badge did more than just change the outcome for one passenger. It created a mirror that forced individuals, institutions, and an entire industry to confront the reality of bias in action. The consequences were not just about accountability for those directly involved, but about fundamentally reconsidering how authority is exercised and assessed in public spaces. Dominic himself never sought to be the face of a movement or the namesake of a protocol. He had simply wanted to reach his mother's hospital bedside without being judged by his appearance rather than his actions. Yet in maintaining his dignity throughout the ordeal, in refusing to accept discriminatory treatment, even when he had the power to end it immediately, he demonstrated the quiet strength that often precedes meaningful change. If there is a lesson in this story, perhaps it lies in Eleanor Reynolds' wisdom about anger, that it can illuminate rather than destroy, that it can fuel reform rather than revenge. For every traveler who now experiences more equitable treatment, for every crew member who makes decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions, for every security officer who practices de-escalation, before force the light continues to spread from that moment when prejudice collided with justice and justice prevailed. What would you have done in Dominic's position? Would you have revealed your FBI credentials immediately, or would you have documented the pattern of discrimination as he did? Have you ever witnessed or experienced biased treatment in public spaces? And how did you respond? This story shows us that one person's experience can trigger widespread change when backed by evidence, courage, and institutional support. If you found this account powerful or thought-provoking, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the complex intersection of justice, identity, and social change. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and help spread awareness by sharing this video with others who might benefit from understanding how bias operates and how it can be effectively challenged. Together, we can work toward a world where people are judged by their actions, not their appearance.